This is Bible stories for sleep. For thousands of years, the stories of Scripture have been a place of refuge, a sanctuary for the weary mind. Tonight that sanctuary opens through the wise men's journey. If you find rest here, a quick subscribe helps us keep these stories coming. Now set aside what you are carrying, trust that tomorrow is in good hands, and let your mind grow still. The air above the Euphrates was cool and still, carrying the ancient scent of damp river reed, sun-baked mud, and the sharp, resinous smoke of burning cedar wood drifting from the high, open-air courtyards of the Grand Academy. High upon the glazed brick ramparts of the great observatory tower, where centuries of Babylonian scholars had mapped the silent turning of the heavens, Balthazar stood motionless. He was an old man now, his bones carrying the quiet weight of many decades spent tracking the slow, majestic dance of constellations across the velvet vault of night. His silver-streaked beard caught the faint, silvery luminescence of a crescent moon, and his eyes, worn and ringed with the fine lines of relentless observation, were fixed on the southern horizon with an intensity that seemed to pull the very stars closer. For months, the scholarly halls below had whispered of the anomaly. It was not merely a conjunction of wandering planets, nor the fleeting streak of a fiery comet that burned bright for a fortnight and then dissolved into ash. This was something entirely singular. A new light, sovereign and resolute, had ignited in the deep indigo silence of the firmament, hanging with a strange, gravitational patience directly above the western trade routes. Behind Balthazar, the heavy brass astrolabe on its carved stone pedestal scraped softly as it was adjusted by steady, meticulous hands. Melchior stepped forward from the shadows of the colonnade, the rich blue silk of his Persian robes whispering against the pavement. In the dim lantern light, his face was a study in fierce concentration. He held a rolled parchment chart, its margins densely crowded with mathematical calculations, geometric projections, and celestial coordinates written in precise, elegant ink. "The angles do not lie, old friend," Melchior murmured, his voice low and measured, carrying the rhythmic cadence of the Persian academies. "I have calculated the ascension thrice over. No known star occupies this declination. Its trajectory defies the established tables of Hipparchus, and its luminosity remains constant, refusing to scatter even as the horizon blurs with the midnight mist." Balthazar did not turn immediately. He reached out, his gnarled fingers tracing the cold metal ring of the astrolabe before letting his hand fall gently to the stone wall. "It is not merely a mathematical curiosity, Melchior. The numbers are the skeleton, but something else breathes life into this phenomenon. For 70 years, I have studied the ancient tablets in the lower archives, prophecies whispered by kings long turned to dust, speaking of a scepter rising out of Israel, a light that would pierce the deep darkness settling over the nations. A low, metallic clink echoed from the stairway below, followed by the light, agile tread of soft leather boots. Gaspar emerged onto the terrace, his youthful face flushed with the cool night air and the exertion of final preparations. He wore the practical traveling garb of a royal envoy, a curved steel dagger sheathed at his belt, yet his shoulders carried the relaxed grace of one accustomed to the open plains rather than the rigid etiquette of the palace. "The dromedaries are saddled, watered, and rested," Gaspar announced, his voice carrying a quiet eagerness that he struggled to temper with solemnity. "The baggage trains are secured with extra rations of dried dates, barley, and sealed skins of sweet well water. The guards at the Ishtar gate have already opened the wicket for our departure. If we move before the cock crows, we can cross the canal before the morning heat begins to shimmer off the salt flats. Gasper walked to the parapet, leaning his forearms against the weathered brickwork to look out toward the vast, ink-black expanse of the Arabian desert that stretched endlessly beyond the fertile crescent of the rivers. The city of Babylon lay spread out below them like a quiet, sleeping giant, its labyrinth of mud brick houses and towering ziggurats fading into the grey mists of the river basin. The merchants in the lower market are full of uneasy talk tonight, Gasper continued, a thoughtful shadow crossing his expressive features. Caravans arriving from Palmyra bring word of shifting patrols, of Roman garrisons tightening their grip on the western roads, and of the perpetual, brooding paranoia of King Herod's court in Jerusalem. They say the roads are fraught with brigands and tax collectors who bleed travelers dry before they even sight the Jordan. Melchior rolled his parchment tightly, securing it with a leather thong before tucking it into a cylindrical brass case. Let the politicians scheme and the tax collectors count their coins. We travel under a higher authority than any petty tetrarch or distant emperor. If this light leads where the ancient texts promise, then no amount of earthly turbulence can bar our way. Balthazar turned at last, his deep-set eyes surveying his two companions. They were men from entirely different worlds, the elder astronomer bound to the ancient traditions of the Euphrates, the Persian mathematician wedded to the unyielding laws of geometry and empirical proof, and the young royal envoy driven by a restless, noble spirit seeking a reality greater than court intrigues and hollow titles. Yet, a silent, unbreakable thread had drawn them together during the past several weeks of observation, binding their distinct paths into a single, resolute journey. We ride into the vast emptiness not knowing the full measure of what awaits us, Balthazar said, his voice carrying the resonant authority of accumulated years. The desert does not suffer fools, and the road to the west is long, dry, and unforgiving. We will face the bitter cold of midnight sands and the scorching breath of the noon wind. There will be moments when the star will seem to falter behind storm clouds, and moments when our own resolve will feel as thin as the desert air. He paused, looking out once more at the brilliant diamond dust clarity of the unpolluted constellations arching overhead. But we go because we must, Balthazar concluded softly. A man cannot spend his life watching the heavens only to turn away when the heavens finally speak. With a mutual nod, the three scholars turned away from the parapet and descended the winding stone staircase into the courtyard below, where their silent companions and the patient, kneeling beasts of burden waited in the cool, pre-dawn gloom. The heavy wooden gates of the observatory courtyard swung outward with a low, melancholy groan, revealing the vast, starlit ocean of the desert waiting beyond. As Balthazar, Melchior, and Gasper mounted their saddles, the dry, crackling snap of leather and the soft, rhythmic jingle of brass harness rings broke the stillness of the sleeping city. With a quiet word of command, the small caravan moved forward, stepping out from the ancient shadows of Babylon and into the vast, luminous mystery of the night. The padded hooves of the dromedaries made almost no sound against the powdery dust of the track, absorbing the earth as the travelers headed resolutely toward the southern horizon, guided by a single, unwavering beacon burning bright in the heart of the infinite dark. The great city of Babylon receded behind them like a mirage swallowed by the violet mists of twilight, leaving only the vast, breathing expanse of the desert stretching out to meet the edge of the sky. Balthazar rode near the front of the small, purposeful procession, his tall frame wrapped in heavy wool of deep indigo, shielding him from the sudden drop in temperature that always accompanied the sinking of the sun. At 70 years of age, his bones knew the weather long before the wind shifted, and tonight they felt the crisp, biting edge of a profound transition. He adjusted his grip on the reins of his dromedary, the dry leather crackling softly beneath his gloved fingers, a steady, grounding sound in the immense silence. His eyes, rheumy from decades of peering through the brass tubes of sky watchers and tracing the slow arcs of constellations across the Euphrates Valley, were fixed entirely upon the southern horizon. There, burning with a steady, liquid brilliance unlike any ordinary star or wandering planet, hung the celestial sign. It did not twinkle with the frantic pulse of distant suns, it glowed with a singular, concentrated authority, casting a faint, silvery sheen across the ripples of the sand dunes. Behind him, Melchior balanced a heavy brass astrolabe upon his knee, the metal cold against his palm despite the thick layers of his blue silk robes. The Persian mathematician squinted in the pale light, his fingers tracing the engraved rings and delicate spiderweb network of the Mater and Rete, attempting to calculate an altitude that defied every established table in the royal libraries. "It sits outside the zodiac," Melchior murmured to himself, his voice a low rustle that barely carried over the rhythmic, muffled thud of padded hooves on the powder-fine sand. No conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, no nova in the house of the fish, could account for this trajectory. The coordinates shift by fractions of a degree every hour, yet it remains anchored ahead of us, an immutable guide. Beside Melchior's pack mule, Gaspar walked with a light, athletic stride, leading his own mount by a braided tether. The young royal envoy from the eastern highlands wore a tunic of crimson wool beneath a light mail shirt, his curved dagger resting comfortably in a silver-chased sheath at his hip. Gaspar possessed the restless energy of youth, but tonight that energy was tempered by a deep, contemplative stillness. He looked up at the vast dome of the heavens, where the Milky Way spilled across the dark like powdered diamond dust, and felt a strange, expanding ache in his chest. Back in the palace gardens of his youth, power had been measured in the height of stone walls, the weight of gold tribute, and the sharp edge of a drawn sword. Yet under this cathedral of stars, those earthly ambitions suddenly felt remarkably small, reduced to the fleeting concerns of children playing in the dirt. He was seeking something far greater, something that kings could not legislate or armies conquer. Guiding them through the labyrinth of dunes was Aria, the Nabatean caravan master. Her skin was the color of weathered teak, etched with the fine lines of a life spent navigating the harshest landscapes on earth, and her dark eyes missed nothing, neither the subtle change in the wind's hum across a ridge nor the faint, sulphurous scent of a distant Bedouin campfire miles to the west. She rode a swift, gray mare that moved with an effortless, fluid grace, picking a path through the wilderness that avoided the treacherous salt pans and soft slip sands. Aria glanced back at the three scholars, her expression a careful blend of professional skepticism and reluctant awe. She had led merchants carrying silk, frankincense, and lapis lazuli across these very wastes for 20 years, and she knew the desert as a living, treacherous adversary that suffered no fools. Men driven by gold were easy to understand, men driven by a light in the sky were an entirely different matter. "The wind is turning from the north," Arya called out, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the whispering night air. By dawn, we will reach the dry wash of Wadi Rum. If we push the beasts too hard now, they will founder in the shifting sands before we find the cisterns. We dare not linger, Arya, Balthazar replied, turning his head slightly without breaking his steady gaze upon the beacon ahead. His voice was deep, weathered by years of lecturing in the domed halls of the academy, yet touched with a gentle urgency. The light does not wait for our convenience. It moves with a purpose, and we must match its stride. Arya gave a short, pragmatic nod, her fingers tightening on her reins. The light may be eternal, Master Balthazar, but these camels are flesh and bone. We will reach the cisterns by sunrise, provided the desert grants us safe passage. As the hours wore on, the temperature plummeted, wrapping the caravan in a shroud of freezing midnight air. The silence of the desert deepened, broken only by the occasional dry rustle of wind-scoured scrub brush and the rhythmic, hypnotic creak of wooden pack frames. Melchior finally lowered his astrolabe, sliding it carefully into a padded leather pouch lined with lamb's wool. His eyes were tired, burning from the strain of calculation in the dim light. He looked at Balthazar's straight, unyielding back and felt a sudden, familiar spike of intellectual doubt. "How do we know, Balthazar?" Melchior asked softly, urging his mule a little closer to the elder scholar's dromedary. "How do we stake our lives, our reputations, and the remainder of our days on a wandering light? What if the texts of Babylon speak of a metaphor, a poetic dream whispered by ancient men who grew old gazing too long into the dark?" Balthazar did not answer immediately. He let the silence stretch out, punctuated by the soft padding of hooves. He remembered the night he had first unrolled the ancient parchment found in the royal archives, the faded ink, the precise mathematical notations made by scholars long since turned to dust, the prophecy attributed to a foreign seer who had looked across the mountains centuries ago. "Doubt is the shadow cast by the intellect, Melchior," Balthazar said at last, his tone remarkably calm, devoid of any defensiveness. "It has followed you across every courtyard and through every calculation. Science tells you what is measurable, what can be weighed in a scale or plotted on a grid. But the human heart, and the cosmos itself, stretches far beyond the limits of our instruments. When I look at that star, I do not see a mere anomaly of physics. I see an invitation. A door opened in the sky by a hand we cannot see, pointing toward a mercy this dark world desperately needs." Gasper listened from the side, his hand resting lightly on his horse's neck. He understood Melchior's need for proof. He had spent his life surrounded by sycophants and politicians who dealt only in calculated advantage. Yet Gasper knew, with a quiet, unshakable intuition, that certain truths could never be cornered by logic. They could only be approached with humility. Back in the capital, Gasper murmured, his voice blending into the steady rush of the night wind, "They talk of power as something forged in iron and sealed in blood. The king in Jerusalem sits behind high walls, trembling at every shadow, hoarding his gold and trusting his guards. If this star leads to a palace, Melchior, I fear we will find only another tyrant waiting in the dark. But if it leads elsewhere, if the ancient words are true," he trailed off, letting the sentence hang in the vast, open night. Then we shall find a king who rules not by fear, but by something else entirely, Balthazar finished for him. Something that makes all the thrones of this earth look like children's toys. Ahead, the flat expanse of the desert began to give way to rising swells of terrain, the dark, jagged silhouettes of distant hills cutting sharply into the southern sky. The air grew heavier, carrying a rich, complex mixture of scents, the dry, earthy tang of sun-baked stone, the faint, resinous aroma of burning cedarwood drifting from a hidden Bedouin encampment tucked away in a ravine, and the sharp, savory trace of roasting lamb over open coals. Arya raised a hand, signaling the caravan to slow its pace. The dromedaries exhaled long, shuddering breaths, their nostrils flaring as they caught the scent of water and animal life nearby. "We are approaching the wells of the Beni Atia," Arya announced, her eye scanning the shadows at the base of a towering limestone cliff. "We can rest the beasts for an hour, water them from the stone troughs, and warm ourselves by the coals before the final push toward the borderlands." As the caravan filed into the sheltered hollow of the ravine, the biting wind died down, replaced by a still, amber warmth radiating from the dying embers of a nomad fire. A few figures wrapped in dark wool rose cautiously from the shadows, their hands resting on the hilts of curved swords, watching the strangers with wary, hawk-like intensity. Arya stepped forward, raising her hand in the traditional Nabatean greeting of peace, calling out in a rapid dialect of the southern tribes. After a brief, tense exchange, the tension dissolved. The nomads recognized the seasoned caravan master and saw the peaceful, travel-worn demeanor of the scholars. They stepped aside, gesturing toward the stone cistern and inviting the travelers to share the warmth of their hearth. Balthazar dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace, his joints aching from the hours in the saddle. He walked toward the edge of the dying fire, holding out his cold, stiff hands toward the glowing embers. The heat washed over his face, melting the frost from his beard and easing the deep lines around his eyes. Melchior and Gaspar joined him, sinking gratefully onto smooth boulders arranged in a circle around the hearth. One of the Bedouin elders, a man with a face like cured leather and eyes as sharp as obsidian, silently handed a small clay cup filled with bitter, cardamom-scented coffee to Balthazar. The elder then looked up at the sky, tracing the position of the brilliant star that still hung directly above the southern crest of the ravine, blazing through the smoke of the fire. "You follow the great lamp," the nomad said, his voice deep and raspy from a lifetime in the dust. It was not a question, but a statement of quiet reverence. "We do," Balthazar replied, taking a slow sip of the dark, aromatic brew. "Do your people know this light? Has it appeared in the lore of the tents?" The nomad stared into the glowing coals for a long moment, the orange light flickering across his weathered features. "My grandfather told tales of a sign written in the heavens before the great empires rose and fell," he said softly. "He said that when the sky itself bends down to touch the earth, the old ways of violence will begin to crumble, and a child will be born who holds the breath of the stars in his lungs." Most men laugh at such stories. They care only for the next oasis, the next trade route, the next battle won. But the sky does not lie. Gaspar listened, feeling a strange, profound shiver run down his spine. This unlettered desert dweller, sitting in the dust of a forgotten ravine, spoke of the same mystery that had drawn 3 learned men away from their libraries and courts thousands of miles to the east. Across vast divides of culture, language, and status, the human soul recognized the same quiet call. After a brief respite, just long enough to water the mounts and let the men stretch their weary limbs, Arya gave the signal to mount once more. The brief sanctuary of the ravine faded behind them as they climbed out onto the high plateau, heading ever southward toward the borders of Judea. The terrain grew increasingly rugged and desolate, a labyrinth of limestone gorges and barren hills under the unblinking gaze of the stars. With every league they covered, the political reality of the region began to press in upon them like the heavy, stagnant air before a storm. Judea was a powder keg of tension, ruled by a paranoid, aging king whose name was a curse word whispered in back rooms, heard, the builder of temples and the murderer of his own blood, a man who saw potential rivals in every shadow and treason in every whisper. As dawn approached, painting the eastern horizon in bruised shades of violet, amber, and pale gold, the brilliant star began to dip lower, its fierce intensity softening into the warm, rosy light of morning. Ahead of them, nestled among the terraced hills of the highlands, the ancient walled city of Jerusalem loomed like a fortress of stone and anxiety, its massive towers standing sharply against the waking sky. Balthazar reined in his dromedary at the crest of the hill, looking down at the sprawling capital below. The journey across the desert had stripped away all their vanities, leaving them dust-covered, exhausted, and profoundly humbled. Yet as the first rays of the sun caught the golden domes of the city, the star ahead seemed to pause, hovering directly over the road that led onward toward the quiet hills beyond. "The journey is only beginning," Balthazar said softly, his voice steady and filled with a quiet, unshakable resolve as he urged his mount forward into the new day. The golden domes of Jerusalem dissolved behind them as the caravan wound its way southward, leaving the tension of Herod's court and the anxious whispers of the fortified city in the dry valley wind. Arya walked at the head of the leading dromedary, her weathered hand resting lightly on the beast's coarse halter, her sharp eyes scanning the rolling, limestone hills that rose like petrified waves toward Bethlehem. The air here carried a different quality than the sprawling, sun-baked plains of the lower Syrian trade routes. It was sharper, scented with wild thyme, sun-warmed dust, and the faint, sweet smoke of distant charcoal burners tending their pits among the terraced olive groves. Balthazar rode near the center of the column, swaying gently with the rhythmic, rolling gait of his mount. The long weeks crossing the vast, unforgiving expanses of the Arabian wastes had etched deep lines into his face, yet his eyes, set deep beneath heavy, silver brows, retained a luminous clarity that seemed entirely untouched by physical weariness. He reached up, his fingers brushing the coarse fabric of his woolen cloak, feeling the ingrained dust of 1,000 leagues. Beside him, Melchior adjusted the heavy brass astrolabe secured to his saddle pack, the metal gleaming dully in the late afternoon glare. The Persian mathematician had spent the morning peering at parchment charts, his ink-stained fingers tracing lines of celestial latitude, trying once more to reconcile the movement of the anomalous light with the rigid geometry of known astronomy. "The angles defy every established table," Melchior murmured, his voice dry as the sand beneath their feet, though there was no frustration in his tone now, only a profound, bewildered awe. "It does not traverse the meridian according to any predictable law. It moves as though guided by an unseen hand, a living sentinel pacing our slow advance." Balthazar turned his head slightly, gazing up at the pale blue dome of the afternoon sky where the star, though muted by the sun's brilliant glare, still cast a faint, silvery shimmer that only their attuned eyes could discern. "Science measures the clockwork of the heavens, my friend," the elder astronomer replied softly, his voice carrying the calm cadence of the Euphrates academies. "Yet sometimes the maker of the clock reaches down to turn the hands himself. We sought a sign in the arrangement of dead stone and ancient texts, but we have been led instead into the living present." A short distance ahead, Gaspar rode with a lighter, more restless grace, his young eyes constantly sweeping the horizon for any sign of movement or peril. The young royal envoy had changed since they first set out from the shaded gardens of Babylon. The eager, restless pride that had once marked his bearing had been ground away by the biting desert frost, the blistering midday calms, and the sobering reality of what they had witnessed in the throne rooms of Judea. He no longer sought the cheap thrill of adventure or the courtly glory of a prince on diplomatic mission. Instead, a quiet gravity had settled into his shoulders, a steady resolve that matched the unyielding march of the dromedaries. The shadows lengthened, Arya called back over her shoulder, her voice cutting through the soft crunch of gravel and shifting sand. She pointed a slender, calloused finger toward the rolling crest of a ridge ahead, where the stone houses of a small, sleeping village began to emerge against the amber wash of the setting sun. We reach the outskirts of Bethlehem before dusk settles. Beyond these hills, the road narrows into sheep paths and rocky gorges. The heavy carts must remain behind if we are to ascend the final rise before nightfall. The sun dipped lower, painting the terraced hillsides in deep shades of violet, ochre, and bruised rose. The temperature dropped with the sudden, desert swiftness, the daytime heat bleeding rapidly from the stones and leaving a crisp, mountain chill in the air. As the caravan slowed to a halt in a sheltered hollow just beneath the shadow of the ridge, the travelers dismounted with stiff, aching limbs, their joints popping in the quiet evening air. Gaspar assisted Balthazar to the ground, his touch steady and respectful. The elder man leaned on his wooden staff for a brief moment, letting the solid earth ground his dizzy senses before looking up toward the crest of the hill. Above them, as the twilight deepened from blue to the bruised velvet of night, the star burst into sudden, crystalline brilliance. It was larger now, burning with a pure, diamond-white radiance that seemed to cast soft, distinct shadows across the rugged limestone landscape, outshining every constellation in the winter sky. "It waits," Gaspar whispered, his breath pluming in the cooling air as he stared upward. "It has drawn us across empires, through deserts, past the very gates of tyrants, and now it stands still." "Because we have arrived," Balthazar said, his voice trembling slightly with an emotion he made no attempt to hide. He turned to Melchior and Gaspar, gathering his traveling companions close as Arya secured the hobbles on the lead animals and saw to their evening feed of crushed barley. "We carry gold, frankincense, and myrrh, treasures fit for a king, gathered from the finest treasuries of the East. But what we offer pales before the simplicity of what awaits us on yonder hill." The small procession began the final ascent on foot, leaving the bulk of their attendants and the baggage train in the protective hollow below. Only the three sages and Arya, who insisted on guiding them through the unfamiliar, winding tracks of the Judean hillside, climbed upward into the gathering dark. The path was narrow, flanked by dry stone sheep walls and thickets of wild scrub oak that rustled softly in the midnight breeze. As they crested the ridge, the village of Bethlehem spread out before them in the starlight, a cluster of ancient, flat-roofed stone dwellings clinging to the terrace slope, silent and slumbering beneath the immense, quiet dome of the cosmos. Yet the star did not hang above the grander stone houses of the village center, nor over the bustling courtyards where travelers from the senses might have crowded. Instead, its brilliant beam poured downward with laser-like intensity upon a humble limestone outcrop at the edge of the town, a rough-hewn cave hollowed into the hillside, traditionally used as a shelter for flocks and weary beasts of burden. Arya paused, her hand hovering over the hilt of her curved belt knife out of instinctive caution, though the utter stillness of the place held no hint of danger. "A stable," she murmured, her brow furrowing in genuine bewilderment. "No king dwells among the limestone caves where shepherds pen their ewes. There is some mistake, wise men. The great lords of the earth live in palaces of cedar and marble." "There is no mistake," Balthazar answered, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden, overwhelming force that felt less like fear and more like homecoming. He took the first step down the sloping path that led toward the dark, recessed mouth of the grotto, where a single, flickering oil lamp cast a warm, amber glow against the rough stone walls. The air inside the shelter was thick with a rich, primal warmth, the sweet, earthy scent of sun-dried straw, the gentle, rhythmic chewing of resting livestock, and the mingled aroma of cedarwood smoke and burning olive oil. In the center of the grotto, sheltered from the biting mountain wind by the ancient stone, a young mother sat upon a simple woolen blanket. Her dark hair fell in soft waves across her shoulders, and her face, illuminated by the golden lamplight, radiated a quiet, unearthly serenity that seemed to suspend the very passage of time. In her arms, cradled against her breast, she held a small child wrapped in simple linen swaddling bands. Standing quietly beside her, leaning upon a sturdy wooden staff, was a man with strong, work-roughened hands and a gentle, watchful expression. Joseph turned his head as the shadows at the entrance shifted, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of three foreign travelers stepping out of the starlight, men whose rich silks, dust-stained robes, and noble bearings belonged to a world infinitely removed from the humble poverty of a Bethlehem stable. For a long moment, absolute silence reigned in the grotto, broken only by the soft, deep breathing of a resting ox and the faint crackle of a small ember in a corner brazier. Balthazar felt the breath catch in his throat. All his decades spent bent over ancient astronomical charts, all his endless calculations of planetary conjunctions, all the philosophical treatises he had written and debated in the vaulted halls of Babylon, suddenly vanished like mist before the morning sun. He saw not a cosmic abstraction, not a distant king of terrifying power, but a fragile, breathing human infant, resting in absolute vulnerability against the heart of the world. With trembling knees, the aged astronomer sank slowly to the stone floor, his old bones aching with the strain, yet feeling remarkably light of spirit. He lowered his forehead until it touched the cool, dusty earth, a gesture of absolute surrender and profound adoration. Beside him, Melchior dropped to one knee, the heavy brass astrolabe slipping from his fingers to clatter softly against the floor, a discarded symbol of human certainty yielding before the boundless mystery of the divine. Gaspar knelt as well, tears glistening in his young eyes as he bowed his head, his hand releasing the hilt of his dagger forever. Arya lingered at the threshold, her practical Nabatean heart pierced by a sudden, inexplicable tenderness. She watched as Balthazar raised his head, his weathered face wet with tears of profound joy, and reached into the heavy leather pouch at his belt to draw forth a small, intricately carved wooden chest containing the finest gold of the Euphrates. The journey was complete. The star had found its resting place. And in the quiet heart of the winter night, the vast and restless universe finally fell still. The cold wind of the Judean hills swept down through the rocky ravines, carrying with it the sharp scent of wild thyme and sun-baked dust. Arya stood slightly apart from the small company, her hand resting instinctively on the polished hilt of her dagger, though no threat lingered in this silent place. For weeks, her life had been measured by the rhythmic sway of camel saddles and the endless, rolling sea of amber sand that stretched from the banks of the Euphrates to this very ridge. Now, the desert was behind them, replaced by the terraced limestone slopes of Judea under a sky so brilliant it felt as though the stars had descended to touch the very tips of the earth. Balthazar knelt on the uneven ground, his aged joints aching with a dull, familiar fatigue that vanished beneath a sudden, overwhelming wave of grace. His fingers, stained with centuries of ink and calloused by the dry winds of Babylon, traced the polished surface of the wooden chest he held. Beside him, Melchior lowered his heavy brass astrolabe into its velvet-lined case, the metallic click sounding unnaturally loud in the profound stillness of the night. The Persian mathematician looked up, his meticulous mind, once so obsessed with the rigid geometry of the cosmos, finally surrendering to a reality that defied all calculation. The star had ceased its wandering. It hung motionless above a modest limestone cave opening carved into the hillside, casting a warm, gentle luminescence that seemed entirely distinct from the cold fire of the constellations. Gaspar stood near the edge of the terrace, his youthful frame taut with a mixture of lingering vigilance and quiet awe. The long months of guarding the caravan through hostile territory, of watching the horizon for desert raiders and navigating the tense, suspicious alleys of Herodian Jerusalem, had forged a deep, quiet strength within him. The glittering court of Herod, with its whispered intrigues and gilded halls of power, felt like a distant, hollow dream compared to the profound, breathing silence of this Judean stable. Here, beneath the vast and indifferent arch of the winter sky, true authority revealed itself not in marble and steel, but in the fragile, rhythmic breathing of an infant. Arya let out a slow, steady breath, her weather-beaten face softening as she watched the three scholars approach the low wooden doorway. The pragmatic Nabatean guide, who had spent her entire existence believing that survival depended solely on shrewdness, water skins, and knowledge of hidden desert wells, felt a strange, unaccustomed moisture prickle the corners of her eyes. She had guided kings and merchants, thieves and ambassadors across the most unforgiving terrain known to mankind, yet she had never witnessed a destination quite like this. There were no trumpets here, no banners snapping in the wind, no pharaohs or high priests awaiting their arrival with ceremonial pomp. There was only the smell of sweet straw, the warm, comforting breath of resting animals, and a light that seemed to wrap around the soul like a mantle of purest gold. Balthazar took the lead, his footsteps measured and reverent as he stepped across the threshold of the cave. The interior was dim, illuminated only by the soft, steady glow emanating from the child and the amber flicker of a small clay oil lamp resting on a rough stone ledge. The elder astronomer paused, his breath catching in his throat. Decades of searching through dusty scrolls in the academies of Mesopotamia, of squinting through tears at the indifferent majesty of the night sky, of wondering if the universe was merely a magnificent, cold machine, all of it culminated in this single, quiet breath. He was an old man standing at the very edge of his own mortality, yet as he looked upon the face of the child resting in the makeshift manger of hay, he felt as though he were seeing the dawn of creation for the very first time. With trembling hands, Balthazar lowered himself further, resting his knees upon the packed dirt floor. He undid the brass clasp of the carved wooden chest and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled against dark purple velvet, lay bars of pure, untarnished gold from the royal treasuries of the East, a tribute fit for an emperor, yet offered here in utter humility. He spoke no grand oration, the weight of his vast learning dissolved into silence, replaced by the simple, profound realization that wisdom was not the accumulation of facts, but the capacity to recognize love when it finally took human form. Melchior stepped forward next, his footsteps soft upon the straw. The mathematician, whose life had been dedicated to the immutable laws of numbers and the predictable dance of planets, stared down at the small, perfect hand of the infant resting against Mary's woolen shawl. His mind raced for a fraction of a second, instinctively trying to categorize the event, to fit this miraculous convergence into some grand celestial equation. But the rigid walls of his intellect crumbled under the weight of an unquantifiable peace. The universe was not merely a mechanism of cold logic, it was a love letter written in fire and starlight. From the folds of his blue silk tunic, Melchior produced a small alabaster jar of frankincense. The resin, harvested from the gnarled trees of distant southern coasts, immediately released a rich, balsamic aroma that filled the damp air of the cave, mingling with the earthy scent of hay and livestock. As he set the jar down beside the gold, Melchior bowed his head, his forehead nearly touching the ground. The great cartographer of the stars realized that his charts had only ever pointed toward a horizon he could never have mapped on his own. He had spent his life measuring the distance between heaven and earth, only to discover that heaven had bridged the gap entirely. Gaspar was the last to approach, moving with the lithe, silent grace of a desert scout. The young royal envoy, accustomed to the glittering courts of Persia and the fierce camaraderie of tribal chieftains, felt the last remnants of his youthful ambition melt away. He had set out on this perilous journey seeking adventure, glory, and a destiny worthy of his lineage. But standing before the child, wrapped in rough cloth and cradled by a humble mother, Gaspar understood the true nature of power. It did not conquer, it served. It did not demand allegiance through fear, it invited devotion through vulnerability. Reaching into his tunic, Gaspar drew forth a heavy silver flask filled with oil of myrrh. The precious resin, bitter to the taste yet renowned for its healing properties and its use in preserving what was sacred, gleamed under the soft light of the star. He knelt beside his companions, placing the myrrh gently upon the stone floor. A deep, resonant stillness settled over the three men, bridging their vastly different cultures, languages, and philosophies into a single, unified heartbeat. Babylon, Persia, and the nomadic plains of the East were no longer separated by vast distances of sand and political hostility, they were united here in the dust of a forgotten Judean hillside, bowing before a king who possessed nothing yet owned the entirety of their devotion. Outside, the night wind whispered through the olive groves, but inside the cave, time itself seemed to hold its breath. Mary watched the foreign travelers with quiet wonder, her hand resting gently on the head of her sleeping son. She had treasured all these things in her heart, the shepherds with their hurried stories of midnight angels, the strange dreams that whispered of salvation, and now these wise and weary men from the far corners of the earth, led by a light that defied every law of nature. Joseph stood near the shadowed entrance, his strong, calloused hands resting on a wooden beam, a quiet sentinel guarding a peace so profound it felt as though the very stars outside had stopped their turning to watch over the scene. Arya remained by the doorway, her silhouette framed against the brilliant canvas of the night sky. The Nabatean guide did not enter the inner sanctuary, feeling the ancient, instinctive reverence of one who knew her place in the grand tapestry of things. Yet, as she looked upon the scene, the golden glow illuminating the faces of the three scholars, the quiet dignity of the young parents, and the radiant peace of the child, she felt a strange and beautiful lightness settle into her bones. The desert was vast, and the road ahead would be long and fraught with unseen dangers, for she knew the political tempests brewing in Jerusalem would not look kindly upon rival kings, however humble their birth. But for this single, suspended moment in time, the perils of the world outside felt impossibly far away. The fire in the small clay lamp flickered, casting long, dancing shadows against the rough stone walls of the cave. Balthazar closed his eyes, not in sleep, but in a deep, restorative communion with the silence that surrounded them. The restless seeking that had driven his academic life for nearly a century was finally at rest. He had looked into the infinite depths of the night sky and found his answer looking back at him with the clear, unclouded eyes of a child. The weight of the long journey, the burning heat of the noon sun, the freezing chill of midnight winds, the gnawing doubts in the barren wastes of the Arabian expanses, dissolved into an immense, quiet gratitude. The wise men remained kneeling in the straw long after the final echoes of the desert wind faded from the ravine, wrapped in a warmth that no winter gale could ever penetrate. The star above the cave burned with a steady, brilliant clarity, anchoring the boundless cosmos to a single, sacred spot of earth, while the quiet heart of the winter night folded its arms around them all, keeping watch over the dawn of a new world. The transition from the open desert wastes into the ancient heart of Judea did not come with a sudden roar, but with a slow, tightening constriction of the air. For weeks, the caravan had moved through the vast and forgiving silence of the sands, where the only law was the movement of the constellations and the steady, rhythmic pacing of the dromedaries. But as the limestone hills of the west rose up to swallow the horizon, the dust took on the dry, bitter taste of old stone and political anxiety. Balthazar felt the shift in his joints before he saw the border markers. The aging scholar sat atop his mount, his silver-streaked beard tucked into the collar of his traveling cloak to keep out the stinging grit, his eyes fixed on the pale ribbon of road winding toward Jerusalem. Beside him, Melchior adjusted the heavy brass astrolabe resting in its leather satchel against his knee, his fingers tracing the cold metal with an absent, nervous energy. The star that had guided them across the Euphrates and through the trackless waste still hung before them, though now its brilliant light competed with the harsh, low glare of human power. "The geometry of the heavens is changing," Melchior murmured, his voice dry as parchment. He pulled a rolled star chart from his belt, squinting at the precise annotations he had made by firelight weeks ago. The angle of declination, which remained so steadfast above the Babylonian plains, now warps against the horizon. It is as if the light itself is being pulled downward, drawn into a gravitational well of human architecture. Gasper reined in his mount, letting the rest of the caravan drift past him as he scanned the craggy ridges above the pass. His hand rested instinctively on the hilt of his curved dagger, the leather grip worn smooth by thousands of miles of sweat and tension. He was young, but the desert had stripped away the polished arrogance of the royal courts from which he came, leaving behind a lean, watchful vigilance. "It is not gravity that pulls at the light, Melchior," Gasper said quietly, his gaze fixed on the dust plumes rising in the distance. "It is the weight of stone. This city is built on secrets. I can smell the smoke of burning tallow and the sour sweat of guards before we even clear the ravine." They were approaching the outer walls of Jerusalem, a city perched upon the edge of a precipice, where every shadow cast by the afternoon sun seemed to hide a spearman or a spy. The contrast between the open, breathing expanse of the desert and the cramped, suffocating alleys of Herdian Judea struck them like a physical blow. Here, under the heavy shadow of the Antonia fortress, the sky was carved into narrow strips of pale blue by towering battlements and high, windowless facades of white marble. Word of their arrival had preceded them. 3 foreign magi, scholars of the ancient Eastern academies, advisors to kings and keepers of secret law, did not simply appear at the gates of Judea without disturbing the fragile, paranoid equilibrium of the court. Within the palace, King Herod the Great paced across the mosaic floor of his private chamber, his heavy crimson wool robe dragging through a scatter of fallen figures. The room was thick with the suffocating scent of imported spikenard and burnt frankincense, a desperate attempt to mask the metallic tang of his own advancing age and the foul breath of decay that seemed to cling to his skin. His eyes, small and darting like those of a cornered beast, fixed upon the captain of his guard who stood rigidly by the carved cedarwood door. "Foreigners." Herod's voice was a low, raspy growl, roughened by decades of suspicion and wine. "From the Euphrates? What business do astrologers from the Parthian frontier have in my city while the tribute is late and the Galileans murmur in the hills?" "They claim no allegiance to Parthia, sire," the captain replied, keeping his gaze respectfully lowered to the floorboards. "They travel light, with only a handful of guards, but their ledgers and instruments speak of immense wealth. They are old men, mostly. Scholars. They speak of a star." Herod stopped pacing. A heavy, chilling silence settled over the chamber, broken only by the distant, rhythmic clank of iron armor from the courtyard below. A star. The word hung in the air like a blade. For years, the king's astrologers and court soothsayers had whispered of ancient scrolls, of obscure prophecies hidden in the damp archives of the temple, speaking of a ruler who would rise from the house of David to shatter the iron grip of Rome and outlive the Herodian dynasty. Herod had slaughtered rivals, executed sons, and drowned rebellions in blood to secure his crown, yet he knew that no amount of steel could murder a rumor dropped from the heavens. "Bring them here," Herod commanded, his fingers curling into the fabric of his crimson robe until his knuckles turned white. "Bring them to the marble court. And bring the chief priests and the scribes." Let us see what these Eastern stargazers have to say to the king who holds the keys of Zion. The transition from the dusty streets into the marble court of Herod's palace felt like stepping into the belly of a white leviathan. The courtyard was vast, paved with polished slabs of limestone and imported Greek marble that reflected the harsh, declining sunlight in blinding flashes. Tall Corinthian columns rose on every side, their carved acanthus leaves casting sharp, geometric shadows across the immaculate floor. Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar walked side by side, their travel-stained robes of wool and silk looking strangely out of place amid the opulent, sterile perfection of the royal enclosure. The guards flanking the archways wore chainmail that gleamed with oiled precision, their hands resting lightly on the pommels of their broadswords. Every eye in the court was upon the three travelers, some looking with undisguised contempt, others with the twitchy, calculating gaze of courtiers trying to measure which way the political winds were blowing. At the far end of the court, seated upon a raised dais of carved ivory and gold leaf, waited Herod. The king looked smaller than his reputation suggested, yet heavier with dread. He sat draped in his thick crimson wool, his posture stiff, his eyes locked onto Balthazar with an intensity that bordered on feverish. Around the base of the dais stood the elite circle of Jerusalem's religious intelligentsia, chief priests in robes of blue and fine linen, and scribes holding wooden writing tablets laced with wax, their expressions a mix of academic superiority and deep, uneasy caution. As the three travelers approached the foot of the dais, Balthazar lowered his head slightly, not in cringing submission, but with the quiet, unhurried dignity of an elder who had spent his life mapping things far greater than earthly monarchs. "You come from the east," Herod began, his voice surprisingly smooth, though laced with a razor's edge of malice. He leaned forward, resting his chin on his jeweled hand. "A long journey for men of your years. They say you have crossed the Syrian desert and the salt flats of Moab, guided by nothing more than points of light in the dark. What brings such wisdom to the doorstep of my throne?" Balthazar looked up, his aged eyes meeting the paranoid gaze of the king without flinching. The lines on the old astronomer's face seemed to map the very terrain they had crossed, valleys of doubt, peaks of breathtaking clarity. "We have seen his star in the east," Balthazar said, his voice deep, resonant, and steady, carrying easily across the hollow acoustics of the marble enclosure. "And we have come to worship him." The words dropped into the courtyard like a stone into a deep, stagnant well. A collective intake of breath rippled through the gathering of scribes. Several of the priests exchanged nervous glances, their hands twitching toward the scrolls tucked into their belts. Herod did not flinch, but a muscle in his jaw twitched violently. His fingers drummed a rapid, erratic tattoo against the armrest of his ivory throne. Worship him. To Herod, the word was a poison. In his world, worship was reserved for Caesar in Rome and for the survival of his own bloodline. The notion that foreign scholars had crossed continents for a newborn king, bypassing his palace, ignoring his crown, looking past his immense fortifications, was an intolerable insult and an existential threat. Yet, Herod's face smoothed over into a mask of calculated hospitality. He forced a thin, dry smile that did not reach his eyes. "A newborn king," Herod murmured, letting a note of mild, grandfatherly curiosity slip into his tone. "How fascinating. My scholars here spend their lives poring over the ancient writings, yet no star has disturbed our skies. Tell me, magnificent travelers, where is this child supposed to be born? Who is he?" Melchior stepped forward, his meticulous nature compelling him to offer clarity, unaware of the lethal gears he was setting into motion. He pulled a small parchment map from his sleeve, though he did not offer it to the king. The celestial alignments point directly to the southern highlands of this province, Melchior stated plainly, his voice devoid of political calculation. The ancient tables of Chaldea speak of a convergence, a light that breaks the darkness, a sovereign whose dominion shall not have an end. We assumed, naturally, that such a birth would occur within the walls of the capital, among the palaces of the great. Herod's eyes narrowed to tiny slits. He turned his head slowly toward the assembly of priests and scribes standing beneath the portico. "You heard them," Herod said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a chilling authority that commanded immediate obedience. "Where is the Christ to be born? Consult the law. Tell these honored guests what our own prophets have written." The chief scribe, an elderly man with a lined face and trembling hands, stepped forward, unrolling a brittle parchment manuscript yellowed by centuries of oil and handling. He cleared his throat nervously, his eyes scanning the ancient Hebrew script by the fading light of the courtyard. "In Bethlehem of Judea," the scribe read, his voice echoing thinly against the marble pillars. "For thus it is written by the prophet, and you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are not least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." The silence that followed was absolute. Gaspar watched the reaction of the king and his attendants with a sharp, instinctive wariness. He saw the way Herod's shoulders stiffened, the way the king's mind was already racing ahead, calculating distances, mobilizing guards, weaving a web of deceit. This was not a court of seekers, it was a den of spiders. Herod stood up slowly from his throne, smoothing the heavy folds of his crimson robe. The warmth had vanished entirely from his voice, replaced by a cold, conspiratorial whisper. He motioned for Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar to step closer, away from the ears of the courtiers and scribes. "Go to Bethlehem," Herod instructed, his voice dropping to a low, intimate murmur, as if sharing a sacred trust. "Search diligently for the young child. And when you have found him, bring back word to me, that I may come and worship him also." The words dripped with honey, but Gaspar felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. It was a lie. Every instinct forged in the treacherous politics of his own homeland told him that the king did not want to worship, he wanted to destroy. Balthazar looked at Herod for a long, quiet moment. The old astronomer possessed the wisdom of decades, the ability to read the human heart just as clearly as he read the movements of the planets. He saw the rot behind the king's eyes, the cold ambition masked by smooth diplomacy. Yet, Balthazar gave no sign of his realization. He simply inclined his head with grave courtesy. "We shall proceed to Bethlehem, sire," Balthazar replied quietly. They left the city under the cover of dusk, slipping through the Jaffa gate before the heavy wooden doors could be barred for the night. The atmosphere inside the caravan had shifted. The naive wonder that had carried them across the Arabian sands was now tempered by the sobering reality of human malice. They knew they were being watched. They knew that invisible eyes, spies, and informants in the pay of the palace were tracking their every movement as they turned their mounts southward toward the quiet hills of Bethlehem. The road out of Jerusalem dropped steeply into the valley of Rephaim, winding through terraced olive groves and rocky hillsides where the shadows of evening lengthened into deep, impenetrable pools of indigo. The air grew noticeably cooler, carrying the crisp, earthy scent of damp soil and wild thyme. As they crested a low ridge, the sky opened up above them, free from the towering architectural obstructions of the capital. And there, hanging low over the rolling southern hills, was the star. It burned with a steady, pulsing brilliance, casting a soft, silver glow over the stone walls of distant farmhouses and the dark, sleeping shapes of olive trees. It no longer seemed distant or unreachable. It felt like a beacon, drawing them away from the poisoned politics of the court and back into the quiet, pristine rhythm of creation. Balthazar drew a deep breath, filling his lungs with the cool night air. The physical exhaustion that had weighed so heavily on his aging bones during the audience in the marble court seemed to lift, replaced by a profound, luminous clarity. "He is not in a palace," Balthazar said softly, his voice cutting through the gentle jingle of camel harness and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. "Truth does not dwell behind marble walls, nor is it guarded by men in crimson robes." Melchior looked up at the glittering expanse of the constellations, his brass astrolabe hanging forgotten at his side. The limits of his human science, the rigid calculations that had once defined his entire world-view, felt small and fragile compared to the living, breathing mystery unfolding before them. "My charts could not account for this," Melchior confessed, a note of wonder in his voice that was entirely free of professional pride. "Science measures the mechanics of the universe, but it cannot measure the heart of the Creator. We have spent our lives looking at the ceiling of heaven, forgetting that the light is meant to lead us down into the dust of the earth." Gasper rode a little ahead, his eyes scanning the dark horizon for any sign of pursuit, yet his heart was remarkably light. The danger posed by herd spies hung over them like a drawn sword, but it could not pierce the absolute conviction that sustained them. They were close now. The journey across empires, the months of isolation in the desert, the suffocating tension of the royal court, all of it had been a crucible, burning away the dross of their old lives until nothing was left but simple, unvarnished devotion. The track narrowed, winding between steep limestone banks where sheepfolds were carved into the living rock. The night grew hushed, save for the distant barking of a dog in a valley below and the gentle, rhythmic pad of camel hooves on the dusty path. The star ahead of them hung stationary, directly above a low, unassuming ridge dotted with the dark mouths of natural limestone caves used by shepherds to shelter their flocks during the winter rains. There were no torches burning there, no guard standing at attention, no luxury or gold to mark the spot. Just a simple opening in the rock, breathing out the quiet warmth of animal breath and the faint, sweet scent of burning cedarwood drifting from a small hearth fire inside. Balthazar slipped down from his mount, his joints aching with the miles, but his footing sure. He did not wait for the others. Carrying the heavy wooden chest of gold that had been prepared for a king, the old astronomer began to walk up the slope toward the cave. Melchior and Gasper followed close behind, leaving the caravan tethered safely in the hollow of the hill. Every step took them further away from the noise of the world, deeper into the quiet sanctuary of the winter night, where the true sovereign of the cosmos waited in the straw. The ground beneath their sandals was cool and firm, dusted with a fine layer of limestone grit that whispered softly with every step. Balthazar led the way, his long woolen cloak catching the gentle updraft of the hillside, smelling faintly of wood smoke, old parchment, and the distant, dry spices of the eastern trade routes. Behind him, Melchior carried the vessel of frankincense, its polished bronze surface catching the piercing, silvery radiance that poured down from the zenith. Gaspar brought up the rear, his hand resting instinctively, gently, upon the latch of the heavy wooden chest containing the bitter myrrh, his young eyes scanning the shadows of the olive trees with the lingering vigilance of a protector. They had crossed rivers of sand, braved the biting windstorms of the Syrian wastes, and endured the stifling, guarded paranoia of Herod's marble-paved courtyards. They had matched their calculations against the shifting heavens, trading the predictable comfort of their libraries for the merciless expanse of the unknown. And now, the vast, wheeling universe seemed to compress itself into this single, quiet hill outside the sleeping village of Bethlehem. The star did not merely shine, it anchored itself directly above a low, unassuming mouth of stone, a natural grotto carved into the hillside where shepherds were known to fold their flocks against the winter chill. The celestial body burned with a pure, diamond-like intensity, casting long, elegant shadows that stretched away from the three scholars like welcoming arms. There was no sound of trumpets, no herald proclaiming a royal decree, only the deep, rhythmic breathing of resting animals and the profound, absolute stillness of a world held momentarily in suspension. Balthazar paused at the threshold of the cave, his chest rising and falling beneath his layered robes. His old bones ached with the accumulated fatigue of months upon the swaying back of a camel, yet as he looked into the interior, a sensation of weightless clarity washed over him. All his decades of peering through brass tubes at the distant, indifferent fires of the cosmos, all his frantic calculations upon damp parchment scrolls, suddenly felt like the tentative, stuttering syllables of a child learning to speak. The universe was not a cold machine of ticking gears and mathematical inevitability, it was a sanctuary, and it had a heartbeat. He stepped beneath the low stone lintel, ducking his silver-crowned head, and the air changed instantly around him. It was warmer here, shielded from the biting desert frost. The heavy, sweet scent of sweet straw, damp earth, and the faint, milky breath of livestock filled the space, mingling strangely and beautifully with the precious resins they carried in their hands. In the center of the grotto, illuminated not by torches but by the gentle, lambent glow that drifted down from the aperture above, sat a young mother. Mary looked up as the shadow fell across the entrance, her dark eyes wide with a quiet, fierce tenderness. She held a bundle of swaddling clothes close to her breast, her fingers resting lightly against the fabric with an infinite, protective reverence. A few paces away, Joseph stood with his calloused hands clasped together, his carpenter's tunic dusted with pine shavings from a day's labor, his face lined with the honest exhaustion of a working man who had suddenly found himself caught up in the designs of eternity. Melchior stepped in behind Balthazar, his meticulous mind, usually so hungry for categorization, for charts, for empirical proof, suddenly standing entirely still. For months, the Persian mathematician had sought a formula that could explain the anomaly in the constellation of Pisces, a logical framework for the moving light that had defied every known law of planetary motion. Yet, standing in the humble light of the stable, every equation he had ever labored over dissolved into insignificance. Here was a reality that exceeded the boundaries of human knowledge, not by breaking the rules of nature, but by fulfilling them in a way no scholar could have dared to dream. The universe had not been solved, it had been redeemed. Gaspar entered last, his youthful heart pounding against his ribs, though the fear and the restless ambition that had driven him out of the royal court had entirely vanished. He dropped softly to his knees upon the packed dirt floor, the heavy wooden chest of myrrh settling gently beside him. The metallic clink of the latch sounded startlingly loud in the sacred quiet, yet the infant did not stir. Balthazar sank slowly to his knees beside the young royal, the joints of his legs popping softly in the quiet air. The elder astronomer leaned forward, his gnarled, ink-stained hands trembling slightly as he reached out to steady himself against the ground. He looked upon the face of the child, and time seemed to fold in upon itself. The infant was impossibly small, his skin flushed with the healthy warmth of newborn life, his tiny chest moving with a fragile, rhythmic grace. There was no royal purple here, no carved ivory throne, no host of armored guards standing watch against the treachery of the world. Yet as Balthazar gazed into the child's wide, luminous eyes, he saw the deep, unchanging foundations of the cosmos looking back at him. It was an intelligence ancient beyond reckoning, clothed in the utter vulnerability of human infancy. "We have seen his star in the east," Balthazar whispered, his voice cracking slightly with emotion, rough from the desert dust and rich with the peace of a journey finally completed. "And we have come to worship him." Mary offered a gentle, tired smile, nodding her assent as she shifted the child slightly in her arms, giving the old men a clearer view of the small face. There was no trace of fear in her expression, only a profound, fathomless grace that seemed to expand to fill the stone walls of the grotto. Melchior moved forward next, his breath catching in his throat as he knelt beside Balthazar. With hands that felt suddenly clumsy and unworthy, he set the bronze vessel of frankincense upon the floor. The resin, harvested from the distant, sun-baked trees of southern Arabia, warmed immediately in the ambient heat of the cave, releasing a rich, billowing cloud of fragrant white smoke that curled toward the high stone ceiling like an unspoken prayer. It was an offering meant for a priest, a symbol of divinity made tangible, drifting upward in quiet adoration. "I spent my life measuring the distance between the stars," Melchior murmured softly, his internal monologue of doubt and analysis finally finding its quiet conclusion. "I thought wisdom was found in the mastery of the vast. But the vast has drawn itself down into the small, that we might hold it in our hands." Gaspar reached for the heavy wooden chest, lifting the lid to reveal the dark, glistening tiers of myrrh nestled within folds of crimson silk. The scent was rich, heavy, and complex, earthy and medicinal, hinting at both the sorrow of mortal existence and the preservation of things precious against the decay of time. The young envoy looked at the infant, and a sudden, overwhelming wave of love swept through him, cleansing him of his restless longing for transient glory. He realized then that true strength was not found in the swinging of a sword or the winning of court favor, but in the absolute, unreserved surrender of the heart to something greater than oneself. He lifted a small piece of the resin, holding it out upon his palm, and bowed his head until his forehead nearly touched the cool earth. "For your leave," Gaspar whispered, the tears finally spilling over his eyelashes to trace warm paths down his travel-weathered cheeks. and for the redemption of all our striving. The silence of the grotto deepened, wrapping around the small group like a warm, protective blanket. Outside, the winter wind continued to sweep across the jagged limestone hills of Judea, rattling the bare branches of the olive trees and whispering across the vast, empty sands of the wilderness they had left behind. But within the walls of this forgotten stable, the wind could not reach them. The cold could not touch them. The plotting tyrants of Jerusalem, safe behind their high marble walls and guarded by sleepless paranoia, were already fading into the irrelevance of passing history, their transient power dwarfed by the quiet, radiant strength emanating from a bed of straw. Balthazar reached out, his long, weathered finger gently brushing the tiny, perfect fingers of the child. To his astonishment, a small hand closed around his own, a grip surprisingly strong and warm, anchoring the ancient astronomer to the very center of creation. All the years of searching, all the lonely nights upon desert rooftops, all the doubts that had whispered through the dark hours of the storm, they were all answered in this single touch. His journey was over. He had arrived home. The three sages remained kneeling upon the floor for what might have been moments or hours, time losing its relentless urgency in the presence of the eternal. The star above the cave continued to pour down its steady, magnificent light, bathing the hillside in a quiet promise that the darkness, no matter how deep or how long, would never truly overcome the dawn. The silence within the small, rough-hewn dwelling was not the silence of emptiness, but of a great work completed. Outside, the Judean night wrapped its cool, velvety cloak around the hillside, the wind whispering through the sparse olive trees with a gentle, rhythmic sigh. Inside, the air was thick with the rich, comforting scent of burning cedarwood, mingling with the faint, sweet aroma of roasting lamb drifting up from distant shepherd campfires in the valley below. Balthazar, the elder astronomer from the banks of the Euphrates, remained kneeling upon the packed earthen floor, his old joints aching with a dull, distant warmth that felt entirely unimportant. His silver-streaked beard rested against his chest, and his eyes, worn from decades of charting the restless movements of the heavens, mirrored the steady, unwavering light of the child before him. The long, grueling months of crossing the vast, starlit Arabian desert, the dry, crackling snap of camel leather, the rhythmic, muffled thud of padded hooves on endless dunes, and the cold, sharp bite of midnight air, all of it dissolved into a profound, unshakable peace. His lifelong search for ultimate cosmic truth had not ended in a grand academy or a royal court, but in the dust of a humble stable, illuminated by the quiet wonder of a newborn life. Beside him, Melchior lowered his heavy brass astrolabes and star charts to the floor with deliberate care. The meticulous Persian mathematician and cartographer, who had spent his entire existence demanding empirical validation for every celestial anomaly, looked upon the infant with a heart completely surrendered to mystery. The precise annotations and geometric calculations that had guided their caravan across 1,000 leagues suddenly felt like crude sketches of a reality far too vast for human geometry to contain. He felt no frustration at the limits of his science. Instead, a great, trembling relief washed over him. The equations of the universe had resolved themselves not in a formula, but in a breath. Gaspar, the young royal envoy whose agile frame and fierce loyalty had guarded them through the perils of Herdian Jerusalem and the jagged mountain passes, knelt with his head bowed low. The curved dagger at his belt, a symbol of the court politics and worldly power he had once sought to escape, felt heavy and obsolete in this sanctuary of absolute peace. The energy that had driven him across the burning sands had transformed into a deep, steady devotion. He was no longer a seeker of adventure chasing the ghosts of glory, but a humble witness to a dawn he had scarcely dared to imagine. Mary of Nazareth sat quietly upon a low wooden stool, her simple homespun garments catching the amber glow of a single tallow candle. Her face, illuminated by gentle candlelight and quiet wonder, held the serene dignity of a mother who understood only a fraction of the destiny resting in her arms, yet trusted the entirety of it. She looked down at her child, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of his tiny heart against her palm, and then raised her dark, luminous eyes to look upon the three foreign sages. There was no need for grand speeches or courtly declarations in this quiet space. Balthazar reached out with hands that trembled slightly with age and fatigue, unlatching the heavy wooden clasp of a leather pouch. From within, he drew forth a small measure of pure frankincense, its aromatic resin carrying the heavy, ancient scent of temple prayers and divine reverence. With deliberate grace, he placed the gift upon the straw near the edge of the manger, his voice a low, gravelly murmur born from the depths of a grateful spirit. "We have seen his star in the east," Balthazar whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime spent searching the dark expanse of the night sky, "and we have come to worship him." Melchior followed, presenting a vessel of purest myrrh. The dark, resinous tears of the gum tree, bitter to the taste yet healing in their application, gleamed faintly in the candlelight. The Persian cartographer let out a long, slow breath, a physical release of every doubt, every fearful calculation, and every weary mile that had threatened to break their resolve beneath the indifferent stars of the desert. The gift spoke of suffering yet to come, of mortal fragility and the bitter trials of a fractured world, but here, in the radiant quiet of the dwelling, even sorrow was transfigured into hope. Gaspar offered the final treasure, a heavy chest of refined gold that caught the flickering light and cast warm, dancing reflections across the rough stone walls of the cave. Gold for a king, fit for the sovereign of an empire, yet laid here upon the dirt floor before a child who possessed no earthly crown, no palace walls, and no guard of soldiers. The young envoy looked at the glittering metal, then at the child's small, unfocused eyes, and smiled. Earthly kingdoms, with their paranoid rulers like herd plotting behind marble pillars in Jerusalem, were transient shadows compared to the quiet, unyielding power radiating from this humble bed. Mary nodded slowly, her expression a masterclass of grace and tender acceptance. She reached out one slender hand to touch the rim of the golden chest, her fingers brushing the cold metal before resting gently on the swaddling clothes of her son. "You have traveled far," Mary said, her voice like the sound of a cool stream running over smooth stones in the quiet hills of Galilee. "Further than you were ever meant to go, through trials that would have broken lesser men. May the peace that brought you here guard your hearts on the long road home." Joseph stood quietly in the shadows near the low wooden door, his strong, calloused hands resting on the lintel. A carpenter by trade, accustomed to the rough grain of cedar and the honest labor of shaping wood to fit a purpose, he looked upon the three wise men with a quiet, understanding reverence. He knew what it was to build something enduring out of simple, unpromising materials. As he watched the foreign scholars interact with his young wife and his miraculous son, Joseph felt the last lingering traces of anxiety, the lingering ghost of Herod's shadow and the weight of their uncertain future evaporate into the night air. They were protected here, not by walls of stone or armies, but by a grace that spanned the entire breadth of creation. The hours drifted onward, measured only by the slow, imperceptible shift of the constellations wheeling across the vast, clear window of the night sky outside. The fire in the brazier burned down to a bed of glowing embers, casting a soft, pulsing warmth across the floor where the travelers sat in companionable silence. The diverse cultures, languages, and philosophies that had once separated Babylon, Persia, and the royal courts from the pastoral hills of Judea were entirely dissolved, bridged completely by a shared, transcendent wonder. They were no longer Chaldean astronomers, Persian mathematicians, or Arabian envoys. They were simply human beings resting in the presence of their Creator. Outside, the desert wind began to die down, leaving behind a profound, breathless stillness that seemed to hold the entire earth in suspension. The sand dunes, which had seemed so menacing and infinite during the long weeks of transit, now lay quiet and silver under the fading light of the guiding star. That singular, brilliant beacon, which had burned with such intense focus above the dwelling, began to soften its radiance, its light diffusing into the broader tapestry of the night sky, as if knowing its immediate work was done, its guiding task successfully fulfilled. Balthazar leaned his head back against the rough stone wall of the dwelling, closing his heavy eyelids. For months, sleep had been a fragile, fitful thing, stolen in brief intervals between grueling marches and guarded watches against the desert cold. Now, a profound, restorative weariness settled into his bones. His mind, usually active with celestial charts and philosophical queries, grew wonderfully quiet. There were no more questions left to ask, no more horizons to chase. The universe made sense, not because every mystery had been solved, but because the heart of the mystery had been found resting in a mother's arms. Melchior watched the elder astronomer drift toward slumber, then shifted his own weight against the packed earth. The mathematician felt the sharp edges of his analytical mind soften, the relentless need to categorize and measure giving way to a deep, trusting acceptance of the unknown. Life was not an equation to be balanced, but a gift to be received. He closed his eyes, listening to the steady, gentle breathing of the child, and felt the last vestiges of his worldly pride wash away in the quiet dark. Gaspar sat cross-legged near the entrance, his hand resting casually near his unbuckled dagger. The threat of Herod's spies, the dangers of the bandit-ridden mountain passes, and the uncertainty of tomorrow seemed distant and unreal. He looked out through the open doorway toward the rolling hills fading into the dark horizon, knowing that their return journey would be long and fraught with peril. A dream had already warned them not to return by way of Jerusalem, yet he felt no fear. The same providence that had guided them across the burning expanses of the Arabian wastes would surely light their way back home. For now, there was only the warmth of the fire, the steady presence of his companions, and the quiet rhythm of the night. Inside the intimate circle of light, Mary gently drew a woolen blanket higher around the shoulders of her sleeping child. Joseph stepped forward from the shadows, offering a quiet, steady hand to help the weary travelers settle into the corners of the room for the remainder of the night. There was a sacred economy in the way they shared the limited space, bound together by an invisible thread of destiny that transcended time and geography. The candle flickered once, sending a final, long shadow dancing across the stone ceiling before settling into a steady, comforting glow. The scent of cedarwood and myrrh hung gently in the air, wrapping around the sleepers like a soft, protective shroud. Across the ancient trade routes, from the scholarly academies of the East to the tense, political halls of the West, the world slept on, entirely unaware of the quiet revolution that had taken root in the dust of Bethlehem. And high above the Judean hills, the stars continued their eternal, silent march across the heavens, wheeling through the deep, velvety dark in a timeless dance of order and peace, watching over the humble dwelling where heaven and earth had finally touched at last. The lantern oil in the brass gimbal had burned down to a stubborn blue bead, casting long, wavering shadows across the lime-plastered walls of the small stone dwelling in Bethlehem. Outside, the night wind carried the faint, sweet scent of dry straw and sleeping sheep, whispering softly against the low eaves of the roof. Balthazar stood in the shadowed threshold, his aged fingers resting lightly upon the rough-hewn wooden doorframe. Beneath his traveling cloak, his joints ached with the accumulated stiffness of 1,000 leagues upon the swaying back of a dromedary, yet a singular, weightless peace had settled deep into his bones. The long decades spent bent over crumbling parchment scrolls in the high academies of Babylon, the endless calculations etched into wax tablets by the light of smoking tallow lamps, all of it had been merely the prelude to this exact, quiet breath in time. His eyes, milky with the film of old age but sharp with sudden, luminous clarity, beheld the interior of the room where the journey's end finally met its beginning. Beside him, Melchior lowered his heavy brass astrolabe into the leather pouch at his side with a soft, metallic click. The mathematician, whose entire existence had been governed by the predictable clockwork of the celestial spheres, by the unyielding laws of geometry and the rigorous proof of numbers, felt the familiar pillars of his intellect gently dissolve into something vastly wider and infinitely more tender. The great star that had guided them across the jagged peaks of Media and the burning sands of the Syrian desert did not hang overhead as an astronomical anomaly to be dissected or measured. It rested here, a gentle radiance that seemed to saturate the very stones of the floor. Melchior touched the edge of his blue silk sleeve, suddenly conscious of how inadequate all human maps were to chart the geography of grace. A few paces away, Gaspar knelt upon the packed earth, his young face stripped of the restless ambition and courtly polish that had marked his departure from the eastern capitals. The curved dagger at his belt, once a symbol of the volatile dangers of the road and the fierce politics of Herod's court, felt entirely forgotten, a remnant of a louder, heavier world that had no dominion in this place. His breath came slow and even, matching the soft, rhythmic breathing of the young mother who sat cradling her child in the dim amber glow of a single clay lamp. Mary of Nazareth looked up from the folds of the woven blanket, her dark eyes luminous with a quiet, unshakable dignity. There was no trace of fear in her gaze, nor the defensive wariness of the displaced and the poor who had known only the cold draught of a stable and the makeshift shelter of a cave. In her face, illuminated by the gentle upward reflection of the child against her breast, rested an ancient, fathomless calm, the stillness of a deep well untouched by the fierce storms that raged across the empires of men. She inclined her head to the three travelers, a gesture of profound hospitality that welcomed them not as foreign dignitaries or wealthy patrons, but as weary pilgrims who had finally found their way home. Balthazar stepped forward first, his sandals whispering softly against the dust of the floor. He moved with the deliberate care of an old man approaching an altar, his breath catching slightly in his throat as the magnitude of what he had sought his entire life finally stood revealed before him. He did not speak of prophecies fulfilled, nor did he offer any grand intellectual summation of their arduous months under the pitiless sun and the freezing vault of midnight skies. Instead, he sank slowly to his knees protesting against the stone, and bowed his silver-streaked head until his forehead nearly touched the ground. From the folds of his heavy woolen tunic, Balthazar drew forth a small, intricately carved cedarwood box bound in darkened brass. With trembling fingers, he undid the leather latch and lifted the lid, releasing a heavy, billowing cloud of fragrant smoke that instantly filled the humble room. It was frankincense of the purest grade, harvested from the sun-bleached bark of trees growing upon the high cliffs of distant Panchaya, resin refined by fire until it became a sweet, ascending prayer. As the white smoke curled toward the rough wooden beams of the ceiling, carrying with it the rich, balsamic scent of antiquity and devotion, Balthazar whispered a silent blessing of gratitude into the dark. The questions that had kept him wakeful through countless nights of his long life, the agonizing silence of the cosmos, the fleeting nature of human breath, the eternal hunger of the soul for something more enduring than dust, were answered not by words, but by the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of an infant wrapped in swaddling bands. The divine was not an abstraction locked within the turning stars, it was here, fragile, warm, and breathing. Melchior followed, stepping softly through the fragrant haze of the incense. He knelt beside his elder companion, his movements measured and precise, yet touched by a new, yielding grace. He reached into his traveling pack and withdrew a vessel of beaten gold, a heavy, radiant chalice hammered by master artisans in Persian workshops, chased with delicate patterns of rivers and vine leaves. As he extended the gift toward the child, Melchior looked down at his own calloused hands that had spent decades calculating the exact angles of the ecliptic and the precise velocities of wandering planets. Science had brought him to the edge of the precipice, had forced him to look up into the vast, indifferent dark and acknowledge the limits of human reason. But it was surrender that had brought him across the threshold. The gold, heavy and cold to the touch, grew warm within the light that seemed to radiate outward from the child. Melchior bowed his head, letting go of the desperate need to master the universe through equations, finding a far more profound liberation in simply being known by it. Gaspar approached last, moving with the lithe, unhurried grace of one who had learned the hard lessons of the desert, that true strength lay not in the sharp edge of a blade, but in the capacity for endurance, wonder, and love. In his hands, he carried a small alabaster amphora filled with oil of myrrh, its surface polished to a milky translucence. The scent of myrrh was heavy, bittersweet, and deep, a fragrance associated with anointing, with healing, and with the solemn passages of human mortality. Gaspar's throat tightened as he knelt upon the earth, for even in the golden warmth of this sanctuary, a sudden, poignant awareness of the world's brokenness brushed against his spirit. He knew the cruelty of the palaces in Jerusalem, the shifting sands of political ambition, and the blood-soaked soil of empires that crushed the weak beneath their iron chariots. He knew that this tiny child, born in a manger and sheltered in a borrowed room, would one day walk directly into the teeth of that darkness. And yet, as Gaspar placed the vessel of myrrh at the feet of the mother, his heart swelled with an unshakable, triumphant joy. The darkness was real, but the light that had pierced it was infinitely stronger. He had sought adventure and found glory, but the glory was not conquest, it was mercy. It was the quiet, defiant persistence of love in a world that traded in fear. Mary reached down, her fingers brushing the gleaming gold, the fragrant wood, and the pale alabaster. She did not speak, but her eyes reflected the flickering amber of the lamp, holding within their depths a silent vow to treasure all these things, pondering them deeply in her heart. Joseph stood quietly in the shadows behind her, a steady, protective presence whose calloused hands had built homes for others while finding only a stable door for his own son. He placed a heavy, reassuring hand upon Gaspar's shoulder, a silent gesture of solidarity between men who knew what it meant to walk long roads in the service of a destiny greater than themselves. Outside, the great star hung motionless over the low rooftops of Bethlehem, its silver beams washing over the sleeping hills, the terraced olive groves, and the silent desert stretching away toward the distant sea. The wind died down entirely, leaving the night wrapped in a velvet blanket of profound, unbroken stillness. There was no sound of trumpets, no fanfare of earthly courts, no marching legions to announce the turning of the ages. The revolution of the cosmos had arrived not with an earthquake or a consuming fire, but with the soft sigh of an infant drawing breath in the dark. Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar stepped backward into the cool, refreshing air of the night, their hearts full, their long pilgrimage at last complete. They walked a short distance to where their weary camels knelt in the dust, resting after their immense labor. The beasts turned their great, gentle eyes toward the travelers as the three wise men settled down upon their woolen rugs beneath the vast, glittering canopy of the constellations. There was no need for further words between them. They lay side by side on the ancient earth, looking up at the high, wheeling galaxies that had drawn them across continents and empires. The cold bite of the midnight air felt strangely soft now, carrying the lingering, sweet trace of frankincense and myrrh upon its breath. Balthazar closed his eyes, his spirit resting at last like a weary traveler who had reached the hearth fire after a long winter's journey. The universe was not a cold machine of ticking stars and indifferent void, it was a home, watched over by a love so quiet and deep that it could fit within the fragile palm of a child. Melchior watched a single shooting star streak silently across the horizon, burning itself out in a brilliant, joyful arc before dissolving into the velvet dark. He smiled into the shadows, his mind finally at rest, content to leave the infinite mysteries of the heavens unmeasured, knowing that the center of all things was not a mathematical abstraction, but a heartbeat. Gaspar breathed in the clean, dry scent of the desert sand, feeling the last remnants of tension slip effortlessly from his muscles. The road behind them was long, and the road ahead would hold its own trials and partings when the dawn finally broke over the Judean hills. But for now, the world was held in a golden equilibrium of peace. Higher still, the great star burned with a steady, diamond dust clarity, anchoring the sky above the humble dwelling in Bethlehem. The night breathed in, long and slow, drawing the entire earth into a deep, restorative stillness. And in the quiet heart of the ancient world, beneath the watchful eyes of the endless heavens, all creation rested, safe and renewed. The golden equilibrium of the dawn did not break with sudden noise or harsh alarms, but rather dissolved softly, like mist rising from a cool riverbed. In the quiet streets of Bethlehem, the ordinary pulse of human life resumed under a canopy of profound and unburdened stillness. The air smelled faintly of wood smoke and damp earth, touched by the clean, sharp mineral scent of the Judean limestone hills. Inside the small, humble dwelling where the journey had finally found its rest, the heavy shadows of the night retreated before a pale, amber light that spilled gently across the packed earth floor. Balthazar stood by the low wooden lintel, his weathered hand resting lightly against the rough-hewn stone. For months, his fingers had clutched the heavy parchment scrolls of Babylon, tracing the jagged lines of constellations and calculating the slow, majestic dance of planets across the dark abyss. Now, those scrolls lay packed away in their leather cylinders, their immense weight suddenly feeling distant and immaterial. He looked down at his own palms, calloused by the reins of a stubborn dromedary and stained by years of ink and desert dust. The trembling that had occasionally seized him during the bitter midnight watches in the Arabian wastes was entirely gone, replaced by a deep, immovable steadiness. He had spent his entire life looking upward, seeking a signature of divine order written in fire across the heavens, only to discover that the final word of the cosmos was whispered downward, wrapped in the fragile, quiet breath of a sleeping child. Across the room, Melchior was carefully packing his brass astrolabe into its velvet-lined wooden case. The instrument, which had served as his compass and his anchor through every trial of the vast and trackless desert, made a soft, metallic click as the latch fell into place. For a Persian mathematician who lived by the absolute certainty of numbers, the events of the past few days had defied every equation he had ever labored to balance. The star had not merely guided them, it had dissolved the boundaries of their calculations, leaving behind a reality far vaster and more tender than any geometry could contain. Melchior ran his thumb over the engraved brass circle, feeling the cool, polished metal beneath his skin. There was no frustration in him now, no lingering demand for empirical proof. The mystery had claimed him entirely, and in that surrender, his brilliant, restless mind had found a quiet harbor. He lifted the case, set it gently beside his travel pack, and let out a long, slow breath that seemed to carry away the last remnants of his lifelong pride. Near the doorway, Gaspar sat on a low stone stool, his fingers idly tracing the intricate pattern of silver wire inlaid upon the hilt of his curved dagger. The weapon that had guarded their caravan through the dangerous territories of desert bandits and the tense, watchful shadows of Herod's Jerusalem felt heavy and out of place in this sanctuary of peace. He unbuckled the leather baldric from his shoulder, the metal rings clinking softly against the quiet air, and laid the weapon across his pack. He would not need it here. The true strength of the world, the power that would outlast empires and shatter the iron grip of tyrants, did not reside in steel or sovereign decree, but in the unshielded openness of a newborn's hand. Gaspar raised his head, his dark eye sweeping over the rustic interior of the dwelling, taking in the simple earthenware jars, the rough woolen blankets, and the serene, tired grace of the mother who sat resting near the wooden manger. A profound shift had occurred deep within his spirit. The restless ambition that had driven him away from the luxurious courts of his youth, the hunger for grand adventures and royal acclaim, had vanished. In its place stood something simpler and far more enduring, a quiet devotion that asked for nothing in return. Outside, the morning sun climbed higher over the terraced hills of Judea, painting the dry stone walls in shades of warm honey and pale rose. The cool breeze of the dawn gave way to the gentle, sun-warmed stillness of mid-morning, carrying the distant, musical sound of sheep bells tinkling from a pasture down in the valley. The time of departure had come, yet there was no haste in their movements. They gathered their belongings with a quiet reverence, each man moving with the deliberate grace of one who knew he was stepping out of a dream and back into the world, yet carrying the dream within him. When they stepped out through the low doorway into the bright, open air of Bethlehem, the village was waking to its daily routines. Women were drawing water from the communal stone cistern, their laughter echoing softly against the limestone walls, and children were darting playfully through the narrow, dusty alleys. None of them paid much heed to the three foreign travelers in their travel-stained garments of silk and wool. To the villagers, they were merely passing merchants or scholars visiting relatives in the hills. Yet Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar walked with a new lightness in their step, their shoulders unburdened by the immense weight of purpose that had driven them across continents. They walked down the sloping path that led away from the village center, heading toward the lower meadows where their resting camels knelt patiently in the tall, dry grass. The beasts turned their long, elegant necks as the men approached, their dark, liquid eyes blinking against the bright morning glare. They, too, seemed touched by the pervasive tranquility of the place, resting quietly without the restless snorting and shifting that had marked their nights in the desert camps. Balthazar paused beside the lead dromedary, resting his palm against the animal's thick, warm shoulder. He looked back one last time toward the cluster of stone dwellings at the crest of the hill. The star was no longer visible in the brilliant glare of the morning sun, but its presence remained branded into the very fabric of the sky, invisible yet absolute. It lived now not in the dark spaces between the constellations, but in the quiet chambers of their own transformed hearts. "We take the southern track," Balthazar said quietly, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely stirred the morning air. "The one that skirts the edge of the wilderness before turning east toward the Euphrates." Melchior adjusted his travel cloak, securing the heavy woolen folds against his chest. A longer way, the Persian observed softly, a faint, reflective smile touching the corners of his mouth. "And yet, somehow, the distance feels shorter than when we first set out under the autumn sky of Babylon. Because we are no longer searching for something we have lost," Gaspar added, taking the lead rope of his mount and untying it from the low-hanging branch of an olive tree. "We are simply carrying what we have found." With a series of low, gentle commands, the men mounted their beasts. The heavy leather saddles creaked in familiar harmony, and with a rhythmic, swaying motion, the small caravan began its silent return. They moved away from the Judean hills, descending the gradual slopes that rolled downward toward the vast, sun-bleached expanses of the Arabian desert. The transition from the green, terraced valleys to the sweeping, golden wastes was seamless. The jagged limestone crags smoothed out into rolling waves of sand that stretched toward the horizon in endless, undulating patterns of light and shadow. The journey home would be long, measured by weeks of steady plodding beneath the immense, arching dome of the sky. But the harshness of the desert no longer felt like an adversary to be conquered. As the days unfolded, the vast emptiness of the wilderness became a sanctuary of thought and reflection. During the scorching heat of the midday hours, when the sun beat down like a sheet of hammered brass and the horizon shimmered behind veils of rising heat, the caravan would halt beneath the scant shade of a rocky outcrop or a lonely acacia tree. There, sheltered from the glare, the three travelers would sit in companionable silence, sharing meager rations of hard bread, dried dates, and cool water from their leather flasks. There was little need for speech between them now. The shared trials of the road, the biting midnight cold, the terrifying whispers of the desert wind, the political tension of Herod's marble palace, and the overwhelming wonder of the stable in Bethlehem, had forged a bond that transcended differences of culture, language, and age. They were three distinct streams that had converged into a single, deep current, flowing steadily toward an unseen ocean of peace. As the sun began its slow, majestic descent toward the western edge of the world, painting the sky in breathtaking strokes of violet, burnt orange, and deep indigo, the caravan would resume its march. The cool air of the evening rushed in to replace the oppressive heat of the day, bringing with it the sharp, crisp scent of desert sage and cool stone. Balthazar led the way, his eyes fixed not on the mathematical charts of his youth, but on the unfolding tapestry of the evening sky. One by one, the familiar constellations emerged from the deepening blue, old friends returning to greet him as he traveled eastward. He watched as the great wheel of the heavens turned with slow, magnificent precision. He no longer felt small beneath that infinite expanse. Instead, he felt intimately connected to it, a part of the grand, living harmony that bound the farthest star to the beating heart of a child in Bethlehem. Melchior walked beside him, his mind no longer wrestling with the limitations of human knowledge. He looked at his astrolabe resting securely in its pack and felt only a profound sense of gratitude for the science that had brought him to the edge of the known world, and for the grace that had gently pushed him beyond it. He understood now that wisdom was not the accumulation of facts, nor the mastery of celestial mechanics, but the capacity to stand in the presence of the miraculous and bow the head in quiet wonder. Gaspar brought up the rear, his young spirit steeped in a rich, poetic tranquility. He looked out across the moonlit dunes, where the pale silver light washed over the rippling sand like water. The dangers of the world, the threats of kings, the rivalries of courts, the uncertainties of the future seemed as distant and insubstantial as the shadows cast by the rocks. He felt a deep, abiding strength settling into his bones, a resilience born not of armor or weapons, but of a quiet, unshakable trust in the goodness of the dawn. Days melted into weeks, and weeks softened into a timeless rhythm of motion and rest. The borderlands of Judea faded behind them, replaced by the sweeping expanses of the Arabian wastes, and eventually, by the fertile, river-watered plains of Mesopotamia. The first signs of home began to appear as familiar landmarks rose out of the landscape, the ancient stone watchtowers guarding the trade routes, the deep green bands of date palms swaying along the irrigation canals, and finally, the great mud brick walls of Babylon lifting their battlements against the evening sky. When the caravan passed through the massive gates of the city, the bustling noise of the markets and the chatter of merchants washing over them like a distant tide, the three men felt a strange sense of detachment. They moved through the familiar streets like travelers returning from a distant star, carrying a treasure that no marketplace could value and no thief could steal. They parted ways quietly at the plaza where their paths first diverged months ago. There were no grand speeches, no theatrical farewells. They embraced as brothers, their hands gripping shoulders with a firm, enduring strength that spoke of everything they had shared and everything they had become. "May the peace of the star be with you always," Balthazar said softly, his voice trembling slightly with emotion as he looked into the eyes of his companions. "And with you?" Melchior replied, his gaze steady and warm. "Until the dawn breaks again," Gaspar added, a bright, serene smile lighting his youthful face. With a final nod, they turned their mounts toward their respective homes, each man stepping back into his own life, yet forever changed by the journey they had taken together. Balthazar climbed the worn stone steps of his rooftop observatory in Babylon, the very place where this vast adventure had first stirred into motion. The night air was warm and heavy with the scent of river mud and blooming jasmine. He set down his travel pack, walked to the low parapet, and leaned his forearms against the cool brick. Above him, the night sky opened up in all its staggering, infinite majesty. The constellations burned like scattered diamonds against the velvet blackness of the cosmos, silent and eternal. He reached out and touched the smooth stone of the parapet, feeling the solid reality of the earth beneath his hands, and then looked up once more into the heart of the heavens. The tension in his chest was entirely gone. The questions that had kept him awake through countless decades of lonely study were answered not by a complex theorem, but by a simple, profound peace that filled his soul to overflowing. He closed his eyes for a long, quiet moment, feeling the steady rhythm of his own breath mirroring the slow, majestic pulse of the universe. Far away, across the silent deserts and the rolling hills of Judea, the world was resting. The little dwelling in Bethlehem was quiet, wrapped in the deep, restorative stillness of the night. The child slept safely in the shadows of the manger, cradled by the love of the earth and the watchful guardianship of the heavens. The wind died down completely, leaving the desert dunes frozen in waves of silver light. The air grew still and deep, settling over the ancient world like a soft, heavy blanket of wool. Every sound faded into the background, leaving only the vast, breathing silence of the night, holding all creation in a state of perfect, unshakable equilibrium. And as the stars continued their slow, silent journey across the velvet sky, the earth drifted deeper into its timeless rest, completely safe, completely renewed, and held forever in the palm of an endless peace. Inside the modest shelter, where the breath of gentle oxen rose in faint, pearlescent plumes against the chill, Balthazar lowered his aged frame onto a low wooden stool with a soft, audible sigh of profound relief. His joints, stiffened by months of relentless saddle work and the biting winds of the Judean highlands, finally found a moment to unburden themselves as the gravity of their completed quest settled over his tired spirit. By the flickering light of a single clay oil lamp, Mary sat quietly upon a rough-hewn bench, her fingers moving with steady, rhythmic grace as she smoothed a fold of coarse linen across her knees. Her eyes, luminous and touched with a quiet, otherworldly exhaustion, met the ancient scholar's gaze with a gentle understanding that bridged the vast chasms of their disparate worlds. She did not speak, for words felt clumsy and intrusive in the sacred hush of the stable, but her subtle nod acknowledged the immense weight of the miles he and his companions had traversed across the trackless wastes. Melchior stood near the low doorway, his tall silhouette framed by the vast, glittering expanse of the midnight sky where the extraordinary star now hovered directly overhead, its brilliance subdued into a soft, pulsing luminescence like a giant pearl suspended in velvet. His mind, usually crowded with the complex geometry of planetary charts and the swirling political intrigues of the Persian courts, felt strangely empty of calculation. The mathematics of the cosmos had finally dissolved into a simple, undeniable reality, a sleeping infant whose rhythmic, shallow breathing seemed to dictate the very pulse of the universe. Gaspar, the youngest of the three travelers, knelt near the edge of the straw-strewn floor, his fingers tracing the intricate grain of the wooden chest that had held their most precious frankincense. His heart still thundered faintly with the memory of their harrowing audience in Jerusalem, where the paranoid shadow of King Herod had loomed like a dark storm cloud over polished marble floors and nervous courtiers. The contrast between the paranoid splendor of the Herodian palace, with its clanking armor, whispered treasons, and suffocating smell of ambition, and this fragrant, manure-scented refuge of simple beasts was nothing short of miraculous. Here, power did not demand allegiance through fear, it invited reverence through utter, defenseless vulnerability. Outside, the Judean wilderness stretched away in undulating waves of shadow and silvered stone, ancient hills that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless empires now holding their collective breath under the immense canopy of stars. A cool desert breeze whispered through the gnarled branches of nearby olive trees, carrying the faint, sweet scent of wild thyme and dry earth, rustling the dry grass with a sound like whispered secrets. Far to the west, hidden behind the jagged ridges of the central mountain range, the stone towers of Jerusalem slept fitfully under the watchful eyes of Roman sentries and the sleepless paranoia of a tyrant king. Herod the Great lay tossing upon his royal bed, tormented by phantom threats and the corrosive whisper of rivals, completely unaware that the true center of all history had quietly slipped past his formidable defenses to take root in a forgotten village of shepherds and stone-cutters. Within the stable, Joseph stirred quietly from where he had been resting against a stack of fragrant hay, his calloused hands resting near his carpenter's adze. He offered the weary travelers a slow, welcoming smile, his eyes crinkling at the corners with a fatigue born of long days and endless traveling, yet brightened by an unshakable bedrock of quiet faith. He poured cool water from a clay pitcher into a small wooden bowl, passing it first to Balthazar with a silent gesture of hospitality that spoke volumes of his gentle character. Balthazar received the vessel with trembling hands, raising it to his lips and letting the pure, refreshing water soothe his parched throat. As the cool liquid settled within him, a deep, restorative wave of peace washed over his consciousness, dissolving the lingering anxieties of the long road, the storms of Arabia, the shifting sands of Mesopotamia, and the cold skepticism of the Persian academies. All his life, he had sought the absolute truth hidden behind the chaotic tapestry of human events, poring over crumbling scrolls in dim libraries and charting the silent dances of distant constellations. Now, sitting in the humble straw of a Judean shelter, he realized that wisdom was not a summit to be conquered, but a child to be held in the silence of an open heart. The night deepened, wrapping the surrounding hills in a velvet blanket of profound stillness, while the celestial sphere slowly continued its grand, imperceptible rotation above the sleeping world. The travelers eventually settled into quiet repose, their bodies yielding to the deep, heavy fatigue of a journey that spanned a lifetime, while the child rested peacefully between earth and heaven, guarded by the silent, watchful majesty of the universe. Outside the humble stone shelter where the child rested, the Judean night hummed with the ancient, dry whisper of the wind sweeping down from the high limestone ridges. Balthazar sat a short distance from the low doorway, his back resting against a weathered boulder that still retained the lingering warmth of the afternoon sun. The heavy woolen cloak he had worn across the freezing passes of the Zagros Mountains lay loosely across his shoulders, its rich indigo dye muted by the pale wash of moonlight. In his calloused hands, he turned a small astrolabe of polished brass, its delicate rings catching the silver luminescence as he traced the familiar, comforting geometry of the stars overhead. Melchior emerged softly from the shadows of the overhang, his footsteps making almost no sound upon the dusty earth. The older scholar, whose hair and beard were the color of winter salt, carried 2 small earthenware cups filled with cool water drawn from a nearby cistern. With a quiet sigh that seemed to release decades of academic weariness, Melchior lowered himself onto a flat stone beside his companion, offering one of the vessels with a gentle nod. The silence here is entirely different from the libraries of Alexandria or the bustling courtyards of Persepolis, Melchior murmured, his voice rich and low like aged wine. There, the silence was always crowded with the ghosts of forgotten scholars and the frantic scratching of reeds upon parchment. But here, this silence feels vast. It feels as though the earth itself is holding its breath. Balthazar accepted the cup, letting the cool rim touch his parched lips before lowering it. We spent our entire lives trying to capture the voice of the cosmos in ink and mathematics, Melchior, he replied, his dark eyes reflecting the steady, unblinking light of the heavens above. We believed that if we could only calculate the precise angle of every conjunction, if we could weigh the silver of the moon against the gold of the sun, we would hold the master key to existence. Yet, tonight, sitting just yards from a newborn who cannot even speak our language, I realize how much of that striving was simply the noise of our own fear. Fear of the dark? Melchior asked gently. Fear of insignificance, Balthazar corrected, looking down at the intricate instrument in his hands. We looked up because we were afraid that down here, amid the wars, the shifting empires, and the endless cycles of human cruelty, nothing truly mattered. We wanted the stars to justify our existence. But looking at him, looking at the vulnerability in that straw, I think the creator of those stars chose to become small precisely so we would no longer need to look upward to find grace. From the deeper shadows of the courtyard, Gasper stepped into the pale moonlight, his tall frame slightly stooped, his fingers idly turning the heavy gold ring he wore on his right hand, a token of his royal lineage that now felt strangely weightless. The youngest of the 3 magi had spent the past hour tending to the tired camels, ensuring the beasts were bedded comfortably in the lee of the stone wall. The guard sent by Herd have pulled back toward the citadel, Gasper reported quietly, his tone laced with a sharp, pragmatic wariness. They linger near the outskirts of Bethlehem like jackals sniffing the wind, but they do not dare approach this place under the cover of this darkness. The local shepherds have formed an unspoken guard around the perimeter, simple men with stout staves and eyes that have watched these hills through 1,000 freezing watches. Herd is a cornered beast, Melchior said, taking a slow sip of water. A man who has murdered his own blood to secure a crumbling throne cannot comprehend a king who wears no armor. When we stood in his marble audience chamber, surrounded by the terrifying opulence of his paranoia, I felt the rot at the heart of that palace. Every column seemed soaked in suspicion. To leave that monument of terror and walk into this open stable is to step from a waking nightmare into reality. And yet, Gasper added, leaning against the rough stone wall of the shelter, his spies know we are here. The gifts we laid before the child, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, were intended as tributes for a sovereign, but in the hands of a poor carpenter and a young mother, they are also a beacon. We have placed a target upon this holy ground simply by recognizing its true worth. We did what the truth demanded, Balthazar said firmly, his gaze lifting once more to the constellation hanging directly above the ridge. The great star, which had guided their caravan across hundreds of leagues of blistering sand and perilous mountain passes, seemed to have softened its brilliance, settling into a steady, golden pulse that warmed the very air around the humble dwelling. It was no longer a pointer drawing them across the map, it was a lamp resting peacefully above a hearth. Inside the shelter, a soft rustling broke the quiet conversation. Arya, who had assisted Mary throughout the arduous journey from Nazareth and had remained through the stillness of the night, appeared in the low doorway. Her face was tired, etched with the profound beauty of a woman who had witnessed something beyond the comprehension of ordinary history, but her eyes shone with an unmistakable, quiet joy. "He is sleeping deeply," Arya whispered, her hand resting against the rough wooden lintel. "And Mary rests as well." Joseph sits beside them, watching the doorway with the fierce, quiet devotion of a man guarding an entire universe within a circle of straw. Melchior stood up, his joints popping softly in the cool night air, and inclined his head toward the woman who had shared every hardship of their final approach. "And how fares your own heart, Arya? You left the quiet safety of your trade and your family to follow 3 eccentric scholars into the unknown Judean hills. Do you find what you hoped to find?" Arya looked past the 3 wise men, her gaze sweeping across the terraced hillsides where the pale moonlight washed over olive groves and sleeping pastures. "I did not know what to hope for, Master Melchior," she replied softly, a faint smile touching her lips. "In Nazareth, life was measured by the daily grind of survival, the heavy taxes levied by distant governors, and the endless whispers of what our people had lost. I thought we were traveling to find a king who would break the Roman spears and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem with fire and gold." She paused, turning her gaze back toward the dark interior of the shelter where the faint, steady breathing of the child could be faintly heard. Instead, Arya continued, her voice dropping to an almost reverent register, "I found that the true strength of the world does not live in the fist that strikes, but in the open palm that receives. This child holds no sword, yet every empire on earth trembles before his innocence. I think I finally understand why the stars had to guide us here. We had to unlearn everything we thought power looked like." The night wore on, the celestial sphere turning slowly on its invisible axis, carrying the constellations westward toward the great, dark expanse of the Mediterranean. The wind died down entirely, leaving the Judean hills bathed in a profound, crystalline stillness. The 3 magi, along with Arya, found places to rest near the entrance of the shelter, their bodies finally surrendering to the heavy, restorative blanket of sleep, while the invisible sentinels of heaven kept their eternal watch over the sleeping child who had changed the destination of every human heart. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Dawn arrived not with a sudden burst of golden fire, but with a gradual, pearlescent softening of the eastern horizon above the Moabite mountains. The deep indigo of the night sky slowly dissolved into washes of lavender, rose, and pale amber, casting long, dramatic shadows across the limestone terraces and the waking olive trees. Inside the shelter, Joseph was already awake, moving with quiet, economical grace as he tended to a small, glowing bed of embers in a corner of the earthen floor, coaxing them back to life with dry twigs and gentle puffs of breath. The scent of wood smoke mingled with the sweet, resinous aroma of the frankincense the Magi had left the evening before, creating an atmosphere that felt simultaneously domestic and sacred. Mary sat upon a clean woolen blanket, her infant son cradled securely against her breast. The child was awake now, his wide, dark eyes catching the early morning light as he watched the play of shadows across the rough wooden beams of the roof. There was an uncanny clarity in his gaze, not the unfocused stare of a typical newborn, but a deep, luminous attentiveness that seemed to look straight through the physical world into the very essence of those who stood before him. Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar entered the low doorway one by one, moving with the slow, respectful caution of men entering a holy sanctuary. They knelt upon the earthen floor, their rich traveling garments now dusted with the travel of a continent, their worldly status utterly stripped away by the raw, humbling reality of the scene before them. The morning watch has passed without incident. Gaspar spoke first, his voice rich with humility. The roads below are beginning to stir with merchants and travelers, and the first caravans are moving out toward the markets of Jerusalem. But here, time seems suspended. Mary looked up, her expression serene and untroubled despite the looming shadow of Herod's court just a few miles away. She offered a gentle, welcoming smile, shifting the infant slightly so the morning light illuminated his face. "My people have waited centuries for a dawn like this," Mary said softly, her voice carrying the cadence of ancient psalms. They sang of a light that would pierce the deepest darkness, yet they imagined it would arrive with the thunder of chariots and the rallying cries of armies. They forgot that the most enduring light of all is born in the quietest corners, unnoticed by those who rule the world from high palaces. Melchior leaned forward, resting his weathered hands upon his knees. "We are travelers from distant lands, mother of the child," he said, his voice trembling slightly with emotion. "We came following a map written in the stars, believing we were the seekers. But standing here today, I realized the stars were simply leading us home to a place we had forgotten how to inhabit, a place of absolute simplicity." Outside, the valley below began to wake in earnest. The distant bleating of sheep drifted up from the lower pastures, accompanied by the muffled sound of wooden cart wheels grinding against the flinty gravel of the trade road. Life in the ancient world was resuming its relentless, pragmatic pace, governors counting their coins, soldiers polishing their bronze armor, merchants haggling over the price of grain and oil. Yet, within this secluded limestone alcove, an entirely new reality had taken root, silent and unstoppable as a seed splitting the hardest stone beneath the winter earth. Balthazar reached out, his long, ink-stained fingers gently brushing the edge of the coarse linen cloth that wrapped the child. The infant did not pull away. Instead, for a brief, breathless second, the tiny hand reached up, wrapping its miniature fingers firmly around Balthazar's weathered thumb. In that infinitesimal touch, centuries of scholarly debate, astronomical calculations, political anxiety, and human loneliness dissolved into a vast, oceanic peace. Balthazar closed his eyes, a single tear cutting a clean path down his dust-stained cheek, as he understood that the long journey across the desert had never been about reaching a destination on a map. It had been about losing everything that cluttered the soul, until nothing was left save the quiet wonder of being held by grace. Outside the modest stone walls of the stable, the cool night air of Bethlehem carried the rich, earthy scent of damp straw, sleeping livestock, and the subtle, sweet fragrance of wild thyme crushed under the wandering hooves of the travelers' camels. Melchior stepped backward into the shadows of the low doorway, letting his broad shoulders lean against the rough-hewn timber frame as he took a slow, deep breath that filled his lungs with the quiet stillness of the Judean countryside. The frantic urgency that had driven their caravan across hundreds of miles of parched wasteland, the relentless tracking of celestial coordinates, the whispered political warnings in the marble-columned corridors of Herod's palace, and the grinding exhaustion of bone and muscle, had entirely evaporated, replaced by an immense, unearthly quiet that seemed to drape over the rolling hills like a heavy mantle of woven silk. Beside him, Gaspar stood motionless with his hands folded deep within the sleeves of his heavy woolen robe, his dark eyes fixed upward toward the vast, glittering canopy of the night sky where the great star still burned with a steady, brilliant radiance, though its motion had ceased entirely, anchoring itself directly above the humble rooftop like a celestial seal upon the night. We spent lifetimes looking into the vast machinery of the cosmos, Gaspar murmured softly, his voice barely disturbing the gentle rustle of a nearby olive grove stirred by a midnight breeze. We measured the dance of planets, calculated the eclipses of empires, and sought the mind of the divine in the cold geometry of the stars. Yet the architect of all those burning spheres chose to enter the world wrapped in coarse homespun, hidden in a place where only beasts and shepherds are witness. Melchior nodded slowly, turning his gaze from the starlit horizon back toward the warm, flickering glow of the earthen oil lamp that cast long, dancing shadows inside the dwelling. Wisdom is a strange traveler, Gaspar. It begins in the pride of what we think we know, and it ends only when we have unlearned enough to finally see what is standing right in front of us. Balthazar was right to leave the scrolls behind in the desert sands. The interior of the stable was bathed in a gentle, amber luminance. Mary sat quietly upon a low wooden stool, her head bowed slightly as she cradled the infant close to her breast, her fingers tracing the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of the child's breathing with a tenderness that seemed almost sacred in its depth. Joseph sat a short distance away on an overturned crate, his calloused hands resting loosely between his knees, his face etched with the quiet exhaustion of a protector who had carried the weight of an impossible mystery across the rugged hills of Judea. Balthazar remained kneeling beside the manger, having relinquished his hold on the tiny thumb, yet remaining reluctant to break the spell of absolute stillness that enveloped the room. The gold, frankincense, and myrrh rested upon a smooth stone near the entrance, their heavy, ornate caskets and vessels looking strangely out of place, yet entirely fitting amid the rustic simplicity of the shelter. Each gift represented a facet of human aspiration, the incorruptible luster of gold for a king who would rule not by the sword but by surrender, the fragrant, rising smoke of frankincense for a priest who would bridge the infinite chasm between heaven and earth, and the bitter, amber resin of myrrh for a mortal suffering who would taste the ultimate depth of human sorrow. Aria, the young servant girl who had tended to the camels and carried the provisions through the harshest stretches of the Arabian wastes, stepped quietly into the doorway, her eyes wide with a mixture of lingering awe and youthful wonder. She had spent her entire life serving in the grand, sweeping courtyards of distant eastern estates, where power was measured by the height of the walls and the volume of the guards' commands, but nothing she had ever witnessed compared to the staggering, silent gravity of this room. Mary looked up, catching the girl's hesitant gaze, and offered a soft, welcoming smile that crinkled the corners of her tired eyes. Without a word, Mary shifted the infant slightly, inviting the young traveler closer. Arya swallowed hard, her heart fluttering against her ribs like a trapped bird, as she stepped across the threshold and knelt upon the straw, her fingertips trembling as she reached out to gently touch the edge of the baby's blanket. In that shared glance between two young mothers of entirely different worlds, one thrust into the center of divine history, the other a nameless wanderer finding her own small place in the universe, a profound, wordless understanding passed. Suffering and hope, poverty and majesty, east and west dissolved into a single, breathing moment of human grace. Outside, the night deepened, the constellations slowly turning their majestic wheels across the velvet dome of heaven, indifferent to the turbulent politics of Jerusalem just a few miles away, where a paranoid king tossed fitfully upon his silken pillows, dreaming of usurpers and plots that existed only in his own decaying mind. Here, in the quiet heart of Bethlehem, the true king slept soundly against his mother's shoulder, cradled by the simple faith of ordinary people and the humbled wisdom of seekers who had traveled to the ends of the earth only to find that the journey led straight into the dust of their own humility. The cool breeze of the Judean night drifted through the narrow doorway of the dwelling, carrying with it the subtle, grounding scent of sun-baked earth, dry straw, and the distant, sweet fragrance of wild thyme clinging to the limestone hills. Inside the dimly lit room, the flickering flame of a small clay oil lamp cast long, undulating shadows against the rough-hewn stone walls, painting the space in hues of amber and deep, velvety indigo. Balthazar sat cross-legged upon a woven woolen mat, his aged joints aching from the arduous weeks of travel, yet his mind felt strangely weightless, cleared of the endless scrolls, celestial charts, and philosophical disputations that had crowded his thoughts for decades within the polished marble academies of Babylon. Across the small room, Melchior tended to the wick of the lamp with slow, deliberate care, his fingers, stained with the dark resins of frankincense and the dust of countless ancient roads, moving with a gentle reverence. Gaspar, the youngest of the three travelers, leaned his broad shoulders against a stout wooden pillar, gazing down at his calloused hands where the faint, iridescent residue of myrrh still lingered upon his skin. None of them spoke for a long time, for the magnitude of what they had witnessed beneath the humble rafters of this shelter seemed to beggar all the rich vocabularies they had spent a lifetime mastering. "We sought a palace," Gaspar murmured at last, his voice breaking the velvety stillness like a pebble dropping into a deep, crystal-clear pool, rich with the lingering resonance of the Persian highlands. "We looked for crimson banners, for guards clad in gleaming brass, for marble porticos inscribed with the genealogies of earthly potentates. We brought treasures fit for the treasury of an empire, believing that the pivot of the cosmos would be guarded by the thunder of power." Melchior smiled faintly, the deep lines around his dark, contemplative eyes softening in the warm glow of the lamp. "And instead we found a carpenter's workshop, the quiet breathing of cattle, and a mother who possessed no more gold than what we laid trembling at her feet." "Yet, Gaspar, did you feel diminished when you knelt upon that earthen floor? Did your wisdom feel like a heavy, useless garment?" "No," Balthazar answered, his voice carrying the deep, resonant timbre of the Euphrates Valley, steady and profound. "It felt as though I had finally laid down a burden I did not realize I was carrying." For all our calculations, for all our peering through copper tubes at the wheeling constellations, we were merely reading the preface of a vast book. The author himself has written the opening lines in the ink of ordinary human vulnerability. Outside, the ancient hills of Bethlehem slept beneath a blanket of ancient stars, indifferent to the shifting tides of empires and the nervous plotting of men who measured their worth in tracts of land and levied taxes. Far to the north, in the fortified citadel of Jerusalem, King Herod's sleepless mind would still be churning through paranoid fantasies, pacing across mosaic floors while his guards whispered anxiously in the colonnades, terrified of a phantom throne. But here, the only crown was the quiet halo of starlight resting upon the sleepy pasturelands where generations of shepherds had tended their flocks through the long, silent watches of the night. Aria, a young woman from the village who had brought a small clay pitcher of fresh goat's milk and a warm loaf of barley bread to the travelers earlier in the evening, slipped quietly back into the shadows of the outer courtyard. Her sandals made a soft, whispering sound against the packed dirt as she paused to look up at the vast, indifferent majesty of the night sky. She had lived her entire life within the shadow of these limestone ridges, her world bounded by the seasonal rhythms of sowing and harvest, the rigorous demands of the local tax collectors, and the quiet, unyielding faith of her ancestors. She had watched the three strange, foreign scholars arrive with their dust-caked caravan, their rich robes smelling of distant bazaars and spices she had only heard whispered of by traveling merchants along the Gaza road. To Aria, the presence of these wise men from the east was a wondrous, almost bewildering mystery, men who could read the secrets of the sky yet bowed their heads before a helpless infant born in a stable. She touched the wooden lintel of the doorway, feeling the cool grain of the timber beneath her fingertips, and wondered what futures might unfold across the hills now that the star had finally come to rest. The world outside remained complex, burdened by the heavy iron fist of Rome and the religious anxieties of the temple priests in Jerusalem, yet within this tiny enclave of light and warmth, a strange, resilient peace held sway. As the hours drifted toward the pale, pearl-tinted threshold of dawn, the travelers prepared for the inevitable transition that lay ahead. They knew they could not return the way they had come, a quiet, persistent intuition, bolstered by the heavy caution of their own worldly experience and the unspoken warnings hovering in the political air, had already charted an alternate route for their departure, skirting the watchful eyes of Herod's patrols by turning southward toward the ancient desert tracks that wound down toward Idumea and the Red Sea coast. Melchior rose slowly, stretching his limbs as the first cool breath of morning stirred the heavy curtains of the doorway, carrying the crisp scent of dew-kissed sage from the valley below. "The road home will be long," he said, looking toward his companions with a steady, tranquil gaze. "The desert does not forgive those who travel without provisions, and the political tempers of Judea grow more volatile with every passing sunrise. We must be gone before the city wakes." Balthazar nodded, reaching down to lift his traveler's staff, the polished wood worn smooth by decades of walking through scholarly courtyards and across endless, sun-scorched plains. "We return not as seekers after a distant sign, but as witnesses to a quiet reality. The star has vanished from the sky, my friends, not because its light has failed, but because it has dissolved entirely into the hearts of men. We carry it within us now." Gaspar gathered his heavy woolen cloak about his shoulders, stepping out into the pale, silvery light of early dawn where their pack animals stood quietly tethered to a low stone wall, their breath pluming softly in the crisp morning air. The eastern horizon was beginning to bloom with delicate strokes of apricot and rose, painting the jagged peaks of the Judean wilderness in shades of violet and gold. The vast expanse of the Arabian desert stretched out before them once more, an ocean of sand and stone that bridged the worlds of east and west, waiting to swallow their footsteps and restore the silence of the ancient trade routes.